I know that we have asked you to present in 10-15 minutes. I know sometimes it's a challenge. We would be glad if you can try to respect that. Before giving the screen to John for a more formal welcome and introduction, I would like to remind you to mute your microphone when you are not talking, or when you are not presenting or don't want to make an intervention. And if you want to make an intervention, or either you can raise your hand when you go in your option, you can raise your hand, or you can also write a message in the chat group. So please mute yourself when you're not talking, so we don't have some background noise or whatever is happening around you. So without further ado, then I will hand the screen to John for a more formal and welcome. So see you then. John?
Thank you, Thomas, and welcome to everybody. Thank you for being here. Necessity is the mother of invention, as they say, and we have been innovating all around to make our work continue. I'm sure that's true for all of you, and I hope you're doing well, each of you, in your own locations. I know this is a difficult time for all of us, but it's great to see so many of you on the screen there. I see many familiar faces, many old friends, and we're really happy for you to be here. I think you're aware that there's a very long history of this work of producing the World Population Prospects. The Population Division has been doing this work since 1951. It's been one of the flagship products of the Population Division. And of course, the WPP offers a comprehensive set of demographic data, which are used to assess population trends at the global, regional, and national levels by many different people. The data set is widely considered to be the most authoritative set of information about population levels, trends, and characteristics. And the data are certainly used throughout the UN system for the calculation of various development indicators, including we estimate roughly 1/3 of the Sustainable Development Goal indicators rely on information from the Population Division. That includes not only the WPP, but also the WUP, but most of those are from the use of the WPP for various purposes. In the latest version of the World Population Prospects, the 2019 edition, was released just last June, we present estimates for 235 countries and areas. And this, of course, requires a consideration of a large number of data sources, which we use to derive consistent population estimates and demographic indicators, filling in the gaps in the official demographic statistics for many countries and areas. And as you know, historically and through the 2019 revision, these data have been produced in what we call a 5x5 format. That's to say, populations were estimated and projected by 5-year age groups and for 5-year periods of time. So now I think most of you have heard that we are planning a major upgrade for the next edition of the World Population Prospects, which should come next year in 2021. And there are several elements of that upgrade, which is really part of a 3-step upgrade that we're imagining over the next 3 revisions. And 2021 is just the first of those. But for the 2021 revision, perhaps the most significant thing is that we're planning to make the transition from the 5x5 format to a 1x1 format, which will be implemented in a true cohort component analytical framework where the population estimated and projected by single years of age and time will have all of the demographic balancing equations satisfied in that 1x1 framework. Today, currently we produce the 5x5 estimates in the cohort component framework, and then we interpolate to get one-year estimates for certain indicators, but then those don't always respect the demographic balancing equation. So to do that properly in a 1x1 framework is, of course, quite challenging, and that's a major part of the upgrade that we want to do and that we hope to implement by 2021. This will make the data more fit for purpose, as we say at the UN, ready for use in the ways that they are needed by the various analysts. We have some groups in the UN system who are very concerned to have 1-year time data. For example, epidemics, following epidemics by WHO, of course, they want to have the information by single years of time. You don't want a major mortality event spread out over 5 years. It's better to have it precisely located in the year when it happens. And the age data as well, there's a call for 1 year data by age, in particular by UNESCO, who needs precise information about the numbers of students at single year age groups. The 5 year age groups aren't really adequate for that purpose. And this will allow us to match better the information that's coming from other countries, in particular countries that have very good data. Of course, throughout all of this, one of our goals is to make the data more open, transparent, and to make all of the estimates and projections more replicable. So we aim to do that. We hope to make more clear the data, the steps, the procedures, and all the methods and assumptions that go into the construction of these data. And in particular with respect to the use of the various empirical data sources that we obtain from national statistical offices. So we want to ensure that these estimates and projections are prepared using the best international standards, following the best methods possible. And we hope that the new one-by-one framework will help to reduce the differences between national estimates and our estimates for key development indicators, especially for countries with very good data. Now, in the process of this, we also need to make the work much more efficient and sustainable. We have faced some severe resource limitations, as you may know, particularly in terms of the number of staff who are available to work on this in the production of WPP. And so we must make the work more efficient and more automated in order to survive, basically. We realize that we need to make the work much more efficient and to make it more reliable and automated wherever we can. And we hope that that will also make it more sustainable so that the population division can continue to do this work even under the increasing demands that we face. So there are various challenges that we face at the United Nations. It's a bureaucratic place. It's difficult sometimes to get things done. And we have severe staffing limitations, and that's not going to change anytime soon. There's been a lot of discussion about the budget situation of the UN. Mostly that's maybe an internal discussion. I'm not sure how much aware people are about the situation outside, but the Secretariat of the United Nations, of which we are part, the Secretariat is now under basically a requirement to maintain a staff level that's almost 20% below what had been programmed. So whereas I'm supposed to have some 42 positions, I need to keep about 8 of those empty at any point, even more than 8, so that we really effectively have something like 33 full positions that we can keep staffed at any one time. And so that's a rather substantial reduction. We were used to having a certain number of positions vacant, but now we're required essentially to have almost 20% of them vacant, which means it's very hard to fill empty posts. It's very hard to replace staff when they leave or retire. And that's partly a result of a situation that it's mostly the result of a situation that existed before the current crisis. There was a cash flow issue that was quite serious, and a problem of member states not always paying their dues on time, which has meant that the UN for several years, actually, this cash flow situation has been getting much worse. And now with the new crisis, we can only anticipate that things could get worse even still. Of course, there are challenges all around from the COVID-19 pandemic, and we're not going to be spared that. We're not being spared currently. We're facing it just like everyone else, and we have to anticipate that things could even get more challenging as we move forward. So the UN, we're very grateful for your participation, let's put it that way, and your potential assistance. The UN has some great challenges in terms of we're not as flexible. We don't have as much spare money. We probably don't have the same big PR machine as some others, but we have some advantages too. And one of the advantages is our reputation in this area of work, our long history, and I think the expertise of our staff. These are incredible advantages that we have in this work and that allow us to continue doing this work, I think, effectively, and we will continue to do this work effectively moving forward. But there's another very important advantage that the United Nations has, I believe, and that is the support that we receive from the academic community and from others outside the United Nations who I think and truly believe want to see us succeed in this work. And in that spirit, we are holding this expert group meeting today. We've invited all of you. We look forward to your contributions. We rely on your contributions. Some of you have been incredibly helpful to us in the past, and we look forward to a continued collaboration with you. You will help us to get through this and to make the upgrade that we need to in this data set. And we are extremely grateful for your help in that regard. And any ideas or contributions that you can give to us, we certainly appreciate. And I will be listening very closely to this meeting as we go through the next couple of days. I may not always be available immediately to respond. Patrick should give me a signal if he's going to call on me to actually respond, because otherwise I'll probably just have the volume on and listening. But I hope all of you will enjoy this meeting, and I look forward to hearing your contributions. And again, thank you very much for being here. Over.
Thank you, John. Sorry. So we'll continue this morning with a brief introduction of what we are thinking for achieving for the next revision. And Patrick will present something about our objective for the upgrade of the World Population Prospect 2021. And after that, we'll have also a short presentation from Peter about the recent work we were doing, trying to systematize and standardize all the options the work we are doing and how we can move forward from here. So Patrick, if you can take the screen now to introduce the objective of what we try to achieve for the next revision. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes,
hello?
We can. Yes, we
okay,
can.
Good.
Yes.
All right,
yes.
all right. Okay. Just to be sure. All right, let me see. How do I get out? I need to change slides to a different deck. Okay, can you see the title of this presentation, all of you? Yes?
Nope.
No?
I don't. Wait.
Okay. Sorry. Is this sharing of screen? Sharing of screen, share. Now, is it visible?
Yes.
Okay, good. Sorry. We had practice session with many people, but some of us still need practices. This is the first ever virtual expert group meeting we are organizing this way. So we are still learning how to do it. So thank you for joining us this morning. And as Thomas explained, we have over the last several years been making a number of a number of upgrades and changes to improve the information that we are using, how we are using it, and how we communicate the use of this information. In the slides I shared with all of you over the weekend, and here is a list of various highlights of some of those points. We have improved the documentation of the different sources of information that we have been taking into account. And we have made a number of transitions with the use of various techniques or methods over the years. But there are a number of challenges, as John has summarized in his overview. And these challenges, let's see if this works. Yes, these challenges that we have been trying to respond in recent years is to make this, especially on the estimation side of the World Population Prospect, the information from 1950 to the recent years, especially in the context of the global monitoring of the Sustainable Development Goals. There is an increasing demand and interest to better understand at the country level what information is used, how the information is used, to derive the various population-related quantities, but also the different demographic estimates, and to reconcile when there are differences, these differences between the different sources of information. So in that process, we have been investing over the last several years in strengthening the information, the way it gets compiled, the way it gets stored, organized, and as part of it, we are moving toward a greater dissemination also of this information through different IT-related platforms that I'll get back in a few slides. And with the work that Peter Johnson is going to present in the next presentation, we have also been compiling and documenting in a more comprehensive form the various techniques, the various methods that over the years, over the different countries, over different periods are being used to derive directly or indirectly different estimates for the different demographic components and to reconcile them. As John also summarized, the next, this process, this upgrade process we have been working on should help us to make more easily available annual time series that most of the consumer of the information we produce are looking for, and to use as best as possible all these different sources of information in a more granular time periods. And for various users who need to work with age distributions that do not, that are not into the standard 5-year age groups, also single age distributions. To meet some of the challenges that also John summarized, we need to improve in that process, to streamline and improve in that process the way all this information is managed and analyzed and estimated in a more efficient way, to be able to be somewhat more responsive to absorb new data as they become available, and to also be more resilient to the various challenges that the UN organization face over time. So WHO a few years ago convened a panel, and there was out of it a useful set of guidelines for accurate and transparent health estimate reporting for global health statistics. And you have about 18 items in that checklist that kind of cover various aspects, both of the input, the analysis, and the results. And these different items in that list here in this table, I have highlighted in different colors. I hope you can see some of the differences of colors. Some of them are in blue, kind of dark blue. Some of them are in red. Those that are in blue are items in that checklist, which is about 1/3 out of the 18. That in the recent years, including the most recent revision, we are either fully or partially fulfilling in terms of providing access to the end users to all or part of this information and these requirements. And in red are the items that are still somewhat pending or we are working on. And in bold red, I highlighted 2 of them, item 8 and 10, which focus primarily on the input, the various country data, and number 10 with the method to be more transparent and more able to communicate and share all of this either technical information or country level type of information. And in that checklist on the right side, you have a couple of years that for now have been indicated, with the goal for the 2021 revision would be to try to meet as many of those supplementary requirements with in priority those two that are in bold, red bold, and the others as best as possible to meet them. And for a couple of items that are toward the bottom of the list right now, there is not a specific year that has been indicated, because in order to meet those requirements, there is a substantial extra effort that is required. And there are a couple of challenges to be able to meet all of this at scale for all countries of the world since 1950 for all demographic components, as what we are going to discuss within the next 3 days. So in that context, I invite you, when you have time, to go back to this table at your own pace. Some of these items that are in blue are so hyperlinks that you can, if you want to get more information of what this implies, you can click yourself and see yourself what underlying information is currently available on those items. Let me see next. So as John was mentioning, the purpose of this meeting is to focus first on 2021 revision, but with the 21 revision being more a step toward future revisions as well. The long-term goal would be to be more accessible in terms of methods and data and analytical steps. And as much as possible, as much as it's feasible in a realistic way, to have a greater potential country engagement and interaction with the various authorities and counterparts in all countries of the world. But you can imagine what it means in terms of logistic and challenges to have that permanent or continuous dialogue with various counterparts. So we need to first have a more streamlined and much more efficient way of using all the information that exists and being able to use it as efficiently as possible, to be able to update and revise the various estimates as new information becomes available. So you have a short list of those key priorities that John mentioned for the 21 revision. And at the end of this set of bullet points here, you have a couple of challenges or constraints and limitations that we face in the work that we and the setting that we operate in terms of access to IT infrastructures, to the timeline, and the various other challenges related to staffing and so on that John mentioned. In terms of IT infrastructure and background, we have developed over the last decade, and it has been an incremental process as time goes. First, an inventory of the key demographic sources providing population data, fertility data, mortality data for all the countries of the world. And in addition, and as a complement to this, we have also been building a virtual repository of documents and various reports, tabular set of information. And this is used as a kind of background resource when we need to go back to extract various missing information, to get back more disaggregated information. And all of this, we have also been gradually storing into a structured database as much as possible, the population-related summary information that we need in the context of the production of the World Population Prospect, but also fertility and mortality data. For migration data, it has been much more challenging to be able to get meaningful and useful nationally representative information in this context. So the key priorities have been first the population and fertility and mortality data for as many countries and as many periods as possible. And this database, we have also been developing, in addition to the database itself, a user-friendly front end to make it easier to access the contents and eventually to add missing information into the database. For the dissemination of the results, we have been working on a companion web dissemination platform that we are in the progress to use potentially for more and more data set of our division. Initially, it has been in the context of the work on family planning as part of a grant from the Gates Foundation to strengthen the work and the data on family planning worldwide. And for the 2021 revision, the plan is to use this platform to disseminate more of the output from the World Population Prospect, not only in tabular form, but also through various interactive visualizations. As you can see a few samples of those, but also to provide access to the underlying empirical data for selected key indicators like total population, population by age and sex, total fertility or age-specific fertility or adult mortality. You already have a living sample through the child mortality website, which is childmortality.org, that provide similar kind of functionalities for child mortality. In the context of the World Population Prospect for 2021 revision, we want to provide through this platform similar type of feature and functionalities to as many key demographic indicators together with the underlying country information. So in the streamlining process that we have in mind, we start typically with country information and we create an initial set of estimates. And this initial set of estimates goes through various steps of evaluation, analysis, and eventually reconciliations. And what this means is that whether it's fertility, population, mortality, and so on, you first basically need to take into account all the data that exists for a specific country, fill in any missing data or add any new data that have become available eventually in recent periods since the last round of revisions, and store and organize all this information into a structured format through, in this case, the database that I have described. And apply a various set of selection criteria to either select all or select a subset of the most accurate information, and apply various techniques, methods to produce a robust set of initial rates for fertility, for mortality. And this is what we will have as a follow-up discussion later this morning. From this initial process, we get a first set of rates and eventually counts. But we need to review and evaluate this data and if necessary, to revise the criteria that are used to include or exclude specific series, but eventually as well to take into account additional factors like territorial changes. Some eventually parts of a given country may or may not be included in some new or some older data. When it comes to registration of births and deaths, quite often some countries have deficiencies, and these deficiencies over time eventually change. They may improve, hopefully, in recent years with more universal registration. And some countries, like currently with the COVID epidemic, you get eventually specific shocks that may exist, especially with annual time series. And depending the sources of data, some of these shocks may or may not be visible. So we may need to take into account or adjust eventually some of this. And in this process, the idea is to have a certain kind of iterative step to revise, review, and adjust the various series based on various factors as it's meaningful in a given context. And once you have already reached this initial kind of best estimates, to go to another step, which is after you have done this step number 6 for each of the demographic components, for fertility, for mortality, eventually for population by itself, you want to bring all the pieces together and reconcile them into the full demographic cohort component dynamic, where you go from one population to the next population and ensure the demographic balancing equation is consistent over time, over age and cohorts. And if necessary, additional adjustment factors may be required to get all of these different components to be reconciled together. And then from that kind of iterative step, you get to the final set of estimates. In the current method protocol or documentation of the world population prospect, we have this kind of flow chart that kind of summarize in a schematic form the overall process we have been using for couple of decades within the population division. And in that context, you get basically what I have tried to summarize in kind of stepwise here through these kind of iterative steps. The question is simply how systematic and how efficient is that process to go from one component to another and reconcile all the components. And this flow chart or this diagram gets probably a bit too detailed. I'm not going to read every details, but basically you go from this empirical data that exists at the country level for the different countries. We have internally some database as well where we keep track of all these data sources and how we use them, what methods we use, and so on. And we prepare for a given country the different type of inputs, both for population as total counts, the fertility, depending the countries, whether you have good registration or you have deficient registration or no registration data, the sex ratios at birth that are associated to it, the mortality component, the population by age, and the migration component. And using these earlier steps that I have tried to briefly summarize, you basically have a number of intermediate steps to use and derive a full integrated set of estimates that you can review, assess, reconcile. And once all of this mechanic is finished for a given country, and eventually for all countries of the world, then you produce a set of aggregates. But obviously to aggregate, you need first to have done all these steps for all countries of the world. And you have a number of data checking or quality assurance steps required. And then you can work on producing all the dissemination outputs for different platforms and different analytical purposes. In this process of upgrading and streamlining as many of these steps as possible, we have been working with various people like Tim Reef, who will be presenting tomorrow some of the work he has been working with us on a set of functions in R to apply, to develop and apply various techniques to evaluate, transform, and adjust demographic data. But we have also been relying on a set of other packages developed by other people like Marius Pascariu for the mortality and the disaggregation of data, as well as some other demographers in Latin America, like Bernardo Queiroz and Everton Lima on some packages related to fertility and mortality indirect estimations. And for the age pattern of mortality, we have some ongoing research and work to expand further the work that Sam Clark and some of his colleagues have been working on over the last several years. Sam tomorrow also will present that work. And for fertility age patterns, we are looking at the option of using a recalibrated version of the work done by Carl Schmidtmann that he will present as well tomorrow. And last but not least, all the probabilistic work for the projection part, we have a set of packages that we are using, implementing various methods that have been developed in collaboration with the University of Washington, with Adrian Raftery and his colleagues. And Adrian and Hannah will be also presenting later this morning some of this work. For demographic estimates, Wednesday, Mark Weldon will also be discussing and presenting some of the work he has done, and we are planning to build on in the coming years. So this is a work in progress, but we have a schedule with a number of constraints. The schedule is, yes, I'm almost done.
Okay, thank you.
I'm wrapping up. So we have a schedule that is somewhat tight, basically in terms of tools, methods, and so on. We are working on all of those things and need to wrap up as best as we can what we can use by the end of basically August. And in the fall, winter, we are planning to use all of these, or as many of these steps and techniques to produce to update and produce the country data, and in the first half of next year to work on the different extra steps that are required to be able to have the public launch in basically next June. So it's relatively limited time to do many tasks. And as John also mentioned in his introduction, this is part of a kind of a longer kind of vision of at least the next 5 years, where basically using the classification, I'm not going to get into too much detail, but if you take into account basically the statistical capacities of countries in conducting population censuses on a regular basis over the last 70 plus years, and the capacity to produce on a timely fashion vital registration, birth and death registration on a continuous basis over the last 70 years, you can basically group countries in 3 large, broad categories. And these categories can be used basically to split the challenges and the complexity of the problem. And the proposal that we are considering would be for the 2021 revision to use, or at least to explore and try to use as best as possible a set of probabilistic methods for full population estimates and demographic estimates for about 50-something countries that have all of these kind of good quality population estimates and fertility and mortality data. And incrementally in following revisions, to scale up to a larger group of countries that have more data challenges, and hopefully by 2025 be able to have as best as possible a full set of probabilistic estimates using as many of all the steps and methods that we would like to use. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Before we move to Peter's presentation, I would like to ask if any of you have some burning question that cannot wait, or and want to react immediately, or if this can, otherwise we can wait for the final session, the final discussion. Anyone has a question? No? Okay. You can also use the chat box if you need, if something comes up a bit later, then you can enter your question in the chat box and we will use that during the discussion also. So let's move on then to the the third presentation of this morning. That is from Peter Johnson. He was formerly with the Census Bureau. And Peter has been working with us since last September to try to make a review of all our methods and try to standardize and systematize our approach and for the next revision. It's a gigantic task. In doing so, we revise many other method protocols from other institutions. It's not easy, it's still ongoing work in process. So we share with you some draft documentation with some flow charts also. We would benefit a lot from your comments. So if you have time in the coming weeks to comment on that document, that would be, we would greatly appreciate that. So now let's turn on to Peter. Peter, are you here?
Yes, I'm.
Okay. So
I'm gonna share my screen.
Yep.
I'm gonna have a. Can you see that?
Yes, we can. If you could put full screen.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. First, I wanted to warn everybody that, or tell everyone that I was really honored and flattered by the invitation from the Population Division to work on this. Unfortunately for them, and partly for me, it took a while for my retired brain and life to transition to virtual full-time work for several months. I needed to refresh and update my knowledge and update new methods, or at least methods that I hadn't looked at, as well as relearn ones that I had learned before. And I learned a little bit of R. Need a lot more work on that. The other thing to remember is that I'm a demographer, not a statistician. So I'm really focusing on some of the very specific components, and not as much how to put them all together. I think there are plenty of good minds out there that can do that. So with that being said, and I do hope to learn a lot from this group. Let's see. So Patrick has shared with you the draft technical documentation. I hope that this can be the basis for a dynamic document that evolves with experience of the Population Division staff. I would like to participate to some limited extent. I have some ideas of things that I can work on that might be helpful. I think that much more detail is needed. As Thomas, I think, just said, I looked at several different organizations, protocols, and realized that what you describe as your protocol, or what you did or how you did it, doesn't necessarily translate into a recipe for how to make this this thing we're trying to bake here. So looking at the last item there, don't be shy with any comments, corrections, or suggestions for improvement. I think you'll notice that towards the end of the document, things got less and less detailed, and that's because I just sort of ran out of time. On the appendix diagrams, they're mostly flowcharts, but they sometimes vary in the level of detail, and I think it's hard to figure out exactly the way to do it. Should you be looping over data sources? Should you be looping over time periods? Should you be looping over methods? Another thing is that I put in a couple of decision tables. If you did a flow chart that fully did each decision tree, you'd have a humongous diagram that would be very, very hard to follow. So the decision table approach is trying to deal with special cases. For example, what if you have no particular data for a period of time? What's the best approach for that? I think there's an awful lot of new information that's going to be presented here. So I have one more slide. I think my focus, again, as a demographer, is focus on separating the signal from the noise. So we know that a lot of the data we use has a lot of noise, and I think somewhat new for the Population Division is looking at the noise, looking at the signal by single years of age and single periods of time, and make sure we don't flatten out the signal by trying to get rid of the noise. The other thing that I think probably wasn't emphasized enough in the documentation is compare. Looking at different aspects of different sources of data, and making sure we can sort of come to a conclusion as to why this estimate is lower than that estimate and things like that. As Patrick showed you, there are a lot of tools that have already been developed, but the question is, how well do they communicate with one another? Are they well validated and documented? And one thing that I haven't seen discussed yet is this question of whether the population data should be mid-year, which has been the practice in the past, or whether it should be the beginning of the year, which is more consistent with calendar year events. And then, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic is playing out now, and who knows what kind of impact that's going to have on estimates. So it's probably good to have the system with single calendar years ready to go when we have this hopefully oddball year of 2020 to represent in the estimates and projections. I think that's all I have.
Thank you. I invite you to go and look at the documentation and the flow charts, because it's very hard. Indeed, we have been doing this revision since many years, and once you need really to write down or try to follow the steps, or really enumerate the steps in detail of which one you do and when and for what reason and what decision you make at what point, is very hard to do. So I invite you all to check the documentation, especially the flowchart, and maybe later on in the discussion we can maybe have more exchange on that point, or in the days or weeks to come. Is there any question or any point you want to react from Peter's presentation or intervention? If so, you just unmute you and speak directly. No? So with these two presentations with Patrick and Peter, it was kind of to set the stage. The estimation and projection are two big chunks. And as you understood from Patrick's presentation, there are many pieces that fit into this big chunk. And now we are going into these little pieces to these two chunks. First, we'll go now to the projection part, and over like a decade or more almost, we've been collaborating with Adrian Raftery and his team, and Hannah, I forgot, I cannot pronounce the name, I'm sorry, Anna Shevchikova. I hope I didn't make too bad pronunciation of it. And they have been very helpful to develop and advise and come up with new tools to project, mostly the mortality and the fertility. And now the new challenge is that we need to have the same tools, but going for single year projection, sorry. And this requires, or this presents also new challenges. So we'll turn now to Adrian, who will present some of the methods and model of statistical model and methods for the projection, and how to incorporate also the uncertainty in all these indicators. So Adrian.
Okay, thanks very much.
Go ahead.
Thomas, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thomas?
Yeah,
yes,
yeah.
Okay, great.
All good.
Let me go here. Okay, so so I want to talk about our efforts in statistical modeling for both estimation and projection to help with WPP 2021 in line with the goals that John and Patrick have outlined. And this is joint work with Peran Liu, who's a PhD student at the University of Washington and who's on the call. So Peran, we might ask Peran to jump in if there are hard questions, and then Hanna Shevchikova, who will also speak. And this, I want to acknowledge support by NICHD. So so a quick outline here. The first thing is we've been trying to develop a method for that brings together probabilistic forecasting, but also estimation, accounting for uncertainty in estimation in the first instance for total fertility. And we've been trying to basically implement that for 1 year time series. And then I want to talk about various extensions of that work, which is that work is fairly close to completion. Extensions to 1 year age groups, to mortality, and then finally say something about incorporating migration uncertainty into the projections. So the first thing is robust annual time series estimates and projections of TFR accounting for estimation uncertainty. And the method here is it's outlined or described in detail actually in a paper by Peran Liu and myself, which has been accepted for publication, actually is in early publication online at the Annals of Applied Statistics. And one of the important things about this, as I think has been mentioned by Peter and Patrick especially, is reproducibility and transparency. So having published articles in peer-reviewed scientific journals that are available with a lot of detail is a very important part of that, which is the case here. So the first thing is that this is based on the UN World Fertility data, which were first developed by the UN the fertility section in the population division in 2015, and that was led by Kirill Andreev and Biddle Combe, who was there at that time, and Vladimira Kantorova. And there's a 2019 revision which is available, and this is publicly available data, and it's kind of was the first step along this path of making all data sources available. It includes all estimates such as from full vital registration, partial vital registration, censuses, surveys, and other sources of total fertility and indeed age-specific fertility, on which the UN WPP 5-year estimates of TFR are based. And while the WPP estimates are 5-year estimates to date, these data sources and estimates are time-stamped to the precise time to which they refer. So this is the first thing. It's based on these data, which is incredible data source. The second step is to estimate bias and measurement error variance for each type of data source for each country. And this really draws and slightly extends the method proposed by Alcom et al. In 2012 in this demographic research paper. The third thing is to extend the UN's Bayesian hierarchical model for TFR, which was initially proposed in this this paper, 2011 paper by Alcom et al. And is in the base TFR package, to add an extra level for the measurements which are in the world fertility data on which the WPP 5-year estimates are based. This is estimated by Markov chain Monte Carlo, and the results are an annual time series estimates of TFR for all countries, with uncertainty about the past and accounting for estimation uncertainty in projections. And we've been working on extending this framework to annual series, and that is fairly complete. And we found, at least for the 5-year version, there's good performance in out-of-sample validation, which is better than the current, slightly better than the current approach, in that it more precisely seems to assess uncertainty. So what does the extended model look like? Well, this is just a plot, a kind of graphical depiction of the model. So the Y's here, YCTS refers to the observed TFR measurements for country C, time T, and data source S, which might be a census or a vital registration or a survey. And these are at different time points, and there'll be typically quite a few of these in a lot of countries. Then the FCT, or the true unknown TFR values, which in this framework get actually estimated as part of the overall estimation. The theta C here and mu C and rho C are the country-specific parameters of the Bayesian hierarchical model. And then the psi is the global or world parameters. And they have a typically spread out and not very informative prior distribution. And then this model is estimated. So a few examples of results. So first, I think this is most important for countries without good vital registration. And I know Patrick has he has outlined this kind of strategy of incrementally going from, tier 1, which have good vital registration data, to tier 3, which have not very good data. And this is looking at a country which would be, I don't know if Nigeria is actually in tier 2 or tier 3, but it's not in tier 1. And so here we've got the kind of raw data for Nigeria, a lot of different data sources. The x-axis is time from 1950 to 2020. The y-axis shows estimates of total fertility rates, and you can see they're kind of all over the map. And as the population divisions, a lot of their efforts have been trying to get overall estimates out of that in the past. And so this is the 5-year estimates that come out of our method, and we've got the data sources, the colored dots as before. The black line is the WPP, I believe 2019 estimates of total fertility rate in Nigeria for the past, and then in red we get the estimate from our process, and then with uncertainty estimates 80 and 95% intervals. And what we see is that the medians, they agree pretty well actually with the WPP estimates. Over here around 1980, our approach, the median hews more closely to the kind of average of the data. And then when you go back to the 1950s, there's almost no data. The big difference is that uncertainty is assessed, and we see in most of the middle from 1970 up to 2015, it's pretty tight. Then it fans out a little bit at the end, reflecting the fact that there is less data is still coming in for that most recent period, and then the uncertainty is very wide for the distant past, where there was very little data. So it's the 5-year version, and this is the forecasts or probabilistic projections that result from that. So the first part of this, which goes to 2020, we see it's exactly this plot, but condensed. And here in blue, we have the projections. So the blue, the light and dark blue, and the blue line, they show the median 80 and 95% projection intervals that come out of our method, taking account of uncertainty about the past. And then in black, for comparison, there's the what comes out of the method without accounting for uncertainty in the past. And you see that indeed the uncertainty, the bands, they increase. They increase, in fact, in the middle there, around maybe towards the middle of the century, they increase a certain amount. And then, but the increase in uncertainty, it's not massive, but it's significant, it's important. And here's the 1-year version, and this is still, it's work which is, I would say, there's an initial level of completion, but there's still quite a lot of work of validation and so on to do. So what we see here is we see the estimates here are 1 year estimates. The uncertainty estimates are also 1 year's, and we see it's more detailed. It basically here, for example, it hews more tightly to the data, but otherwise qualitatively it's pretty similar. But this does represent the sort of the variation, the year-to-year variation, better than, for example, the WPP 5-year estimates. So results with good vital registration data, and an example is Hungary, which I think is tier 1 table, a tier 1 country. And essentially what we see here is that the estimates, they hew, from our method, they hew pretty closely to the vital registration estimates, and the more closely, in black we have the existing WPP estimates, the 5-year WPP estimates, but there is a bit of smoothing goes on, so they don't exactly interpolate, go right through the vital registration data. So, and we see again at the end there's more uncertainty. So for the 90 or so countries with good vital registration, the method pretty closely tracks the VR estimate, more closely than the 5-year WPP estimates, with relatively small assessed uncertainty. So some extensions here. So 1 year age groups, the UN's current methods for breaking TFR down to 5-year age groups, which are kind of summarized in this paper by Shevchenko, Vallée, Kantarova, and Gerland, and myself. They're based on a convergence to a low fertility age pattern of fertility, which is an idea that Vladimira Kantarova came up with, and is described in this paper, and it seems to work extremely well. There's a paper by Christina in PNAS by Christina Bock-Ewald, which compares 24 different methods of of age-specific fertility forecasting, and the UN method, including this, comes out, I think, in the top 4 methods anyway out of these, and they're the only ones that that beat very simple freeze rate method. So it works very well. This, I think, is quite easily extensible from 5-year age groups to 1-year age groups. There's nothing inherent to the 5-year framework about it. For mortality, I think a similar method to TFR should work, but we'd need there would be a need for an analog to the world fertility data, which to my knowledge doesn't yet exist for mortality, but it's definitely in the work program, as Patrick and Peter were outlining. So for example, using mortality estimates from the data sources in the UN World Mortality Report 2019 data inventory, which would be part of the data demog, I think, that Patrick is talking about. But once that's available, it'd be possible, I think, to do something very similar for mortality. The UN's current methods for does that get translated to 1-year age groups, single years of age? The UN's method for translating probabilistic life expectancy forecasts to age-specific mortality for 5-year age groups use one of several methods which are used on a kind of mix and match basis for different countries. There's the coherent rotated Lee-Carter method, which is described in the Lilly and Gerland paper in 2013 in demography, or the so-called pattern mortality decline, or PMD method, which is due to Kirill Andreev with Danan Gu and Patrick Gerland in 2013. And these are both implemented in the MORTCAST-R package. And once again, there's nothing in these methods that is inherent to 5-year age groups, and these should be extensible to 1-year age groups. And then the 1-by-1 probabilistic population projections would be available by applying the core component method to the output of the fertility and mortality methods. And this would be an extension of the base pop R package, which encodes the methods used by the UN for the 5x5 probabilistic population projections at the moment. And conceptually, there's no great leap in doing this. Computationally, there are challenges, and Hannah will talk about that in her talk. So the last thing I want to just talk about briefly is incorporating migration uncertainty. And migration has been, international migration has been kind of the stepchild of population projections, certainly at the UN, I think generally around the world. WP projections are currently based on the assumption that net migration mostly stays constant at its current level in all countries until 2050, and then declines linearly, reaching zero in 2150. And uncertainty about migration is not yet incorporated. And I think it's fair to say that this method doesn't either represent the kind of variability in migration that is typically observed, and so there'd be maybe a consensus that there's quite a bit of room for improvement in this. So methods for probabilistic projection of net migration exist, and they're described in this paper by John Azos and myself in Demography in 2015. The UN has historically, since the beginning, based population projections on net migration, not because it's in an ideal world the best thing to do, but because it has been probably the data about migration, which is of probably the best available quality for all countries. So and methods for probabilistic population projections based on this have been developed in this paper in PNAS in 2016. And indeed, our group has applied these methods to the WPP 2017 data, and projections, population projections for all countries incorporating migration uncertainty are actually available here from the WP 2017. They're available in the form of the trajectory, so you can go in and download 1,000 trajectories. It's not a full report like the UN does. So that means I think that there's a whole framework is in place, including software code to do this. Probably could be done in WPP 2021. Question is, of course, a bandwidth for the division. So just to summarize, statistical methods have been developed for robust single-year estimation and projection of TFR, including estimation uncertainty, and also for incorporating uncertainty about international migration in population projections. And I believe these could be extended they could certainly be extended readily to single year of age projections and estimation. They could also be extended to mortality in principle, but there's a need for more development on that, both on the data side, and also just basically developing the details of the method and validating it. So for mortality, it's probably not a 2021 perspective, and so and I believe it's feasible for these to be ready for WPP 2021. So thank you.
Thank you, Adrian. Any burning question from the participants?
Hi, I have a question.
Yeah.
This is Jeff Eaton from Imperial College London. This is Jeff Eaton from Imperial College London.
Jeff Eaton.
Hi, Jeff.
How are you? I was curious about why the approach of modeling and forecasting TFR and then ASFR as a second step, and if you think that is preferable, or if that's kind of just where we're at methodologically now, or if it's kind of conceptually preferable to handle TFR and ASFR separately.
Yeah, so that's that certainly goes back to not just to the probabilistic, our involvement in the probabilistic work since 2005 or whatever, but it goes back to the 1990s at least. The UN Population Division has a long tradition of doing projections of TFR, and I think there's I think one can do it by modeling the multivariate ASFRs. I personally think there is a lot to be said for the traditional UN approach of first focusing on TFR and then, translating that to ASFR, because from a statistical point of view, it's much easier to project a univariate series and then a highly multivariate series. That's, if you to project the highly multivariate series is, it is quite challenging statistically, and it requires one to get not just the univariate time series, but also all that massive, basically dynamic correlation matrix. So, and I think that this approach, it has worked very well in terms of projections, out of sample validation, and so on. I think it has stood the test of time, and also that the Bock-Ewald PNAS 2018 paper compared, these 24 methods for projecting ASFR, including a lot of methods that focused on ASFR, and basically found that, 20 of the 24, including most of the ones that tried to do ASFR itself, did not do particularly well, and the UN method actually outperformed almost all the other methods. So I think there is quite a, I would actually I would argue for it, but I think of course it's conceivable that somebody could come up with a better method based on ASFRs, but personally I would be surprised.
Yeah, thank you. Patrick wanted also to react to that point.
Just in one sentence, in addition to what Adrian was explaining, historically, one of the reasons also to kind of decompose the level and the pattern is that when you do scenarios, it gives you more flexibility to do what if under different assumptions of the distribution, at what age women have children, whether it's more or less concentrated at an earlier or later age versus the number of children. So historically, it's not just in the UN, it's quite a classic way of decomposing the problem between level and age distribution. And Thomas, for example, has recently done a population fact in our division, comparing the contrast between if you assume one versus the other, what would be the population impact? Over.
I'd just add one very small thing, which is that there is, I think, a lot of evidence that a lot of the important variation in ASFR is actually captured by the overall level, which is summarized by TFR, which is essentially the average fertility over age. And there's some very nice work was done by Dalkat Edliev in Vienna, which he presented at PA but never got around to publishing, unfortunately. But he looked at variation in fertility in ASFR and patterns and decomposed it by the level. Basically, he looked at the level, then the mean age of childbearing and the standard deviation of age of childbearing. So the level being TFR, and he found that by far TFR accounted for the most variation. That mean age of childbearing, which is something in demography we know for a long time, doesn't vary very much even when the ASFR pattern varies. And finally, that the standard deviation in age of childbearing is not, is not a big. It's kind of orthogonal and not a really big contributor to overall uncertainty. So I think all these things point to to doing what focusing first on the level and the TFR.
Okay, thank you. We will now turn to Hannah. We're a bit behind the agenda, the schedule, despite my cuckoo clock. So we'll be on with Anna. Adrian, if you can stop sharing your screen.
Yes, thank you.
And now we'll go to technicalities in R and the R packages that Hannah has been working on?
Oops. Can you see my screen?
Yes, but so far no.
Okay, good.
I don't see presentation. I just see your.
Oh.
Here now, yeah.
There.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, there it is. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Thomas. So I'm going to give a status report on the work we have done in terms of probabilistic population projections for annual time series. Oops. Oh. Oh, I cannot advance it. Oh, jeez.
Press.
What? Sorry about this. So if I do full screen. Oh, now I can. Now I can. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to talk about changes we made to the total fertility rate model, then challenges that we encountered in projecting TFR annually. Then I'm going to talk about changes into the life expectancy model and status of the remaining packages, Modcast and BasePop. So in terms of the total fertility rate, so the model implemented in base TFR is the model of AlcheMed AL 2011, and it's designed for 5-year time series. For 1-year version, we had to make changes in prior distribution of 2 parameters, one that relates to country's maximum decrement, and the other one is maximum standard deviation of distortions. Another thing we have to think about was how do we identify now phase 3, the post-fertility transition. In the current 5-year version, country enters phase 3 when it experiences 2 consecutive increases below 2. So 2 consecutive increases below 2 this is 10 years, right? It would be much more challenging in the 1-year version. So what we did, we obtained 5-year averages, and then we used the same rule as in the 5-year version. And that makes it consistent with the 5-year model. The method for assessing correlation between countries, we have not revised that yet. And we tested our changes on 3 simulations. One that uses the UN interpolated annual TFR data from WPP. I will call this interp simulation. That one that is using the annual estimates based on the UN world fertility data. This is the median that Adrian was talking about from the UN draft theory, and I will call this WFD. And then also I tested simulation with data estimated by IHME 2017, the TFR estimates. Call this IHME. And then I will compare these 3 simulations to 5-year WPP simulation and denoted it by 5Y. So we encountered a few challenges when doing these simulations and analyzing the results. One is that projections can have less uncertainty than the 5-year model. And this is more prevalent for phase 2 countries. So this is example of Kenya. We have time on the x-axis and TFR on the y-axis. The orange line are the annual time series. And then we have, in blue, we have the 5-year projections. And in red, the annual projections. And you have the median, 80 and 95% probability interval in solid dashed and dotted lines. So you see on the left, that's the interpolated simulation. The uncertainty is much smaller than the 5-year simulation. For the WFD is better, but still underestimating uncertainty, and IHME is similar like WFD. For phase 3 countries, this is an example of Austria. Again, interpolated is significantly smaller, less uncertainty. For WFD is better, but still underestimating, and the same for IHME. So we looked into this issue and we found that there is additional autocorrelation in model residuals that is not yet taken into account by the model. Another challenge was that the MCMCs do not like interpolated data, and for the interp simulation, they often do not converge. And another one, a little bit related to the one above, is that the double logistic fit can be different from the 5-year model. So here are results from an estimation. So this is the double logistic fit. So we have TFR on the x-axis in the reverse order, and the TFR decrement on the y-axis, and the dots are the observed data. And here on the upper left, we see the 5-year simulation, and this is all these plots are for Zambia. So we see the 5-year simulation, the expected decrement of TFR estimated with the red lines, median, and dashed lines as 80% interval. And then on the upper right, you see the interpolated results. And you see that what the 5-year simulation can interpret as noise, here the interpolated one makes it basically real signal, right? And the model try to, so this, in this case, we have 2 modes. This is actually a case for many countries. And the model tries to fit both modes and results in several clusters of these double logistic curves. For the WFD on bottom left is, this is not interpolated, right? And this is much better. And in this case, it's actually very resembles the 5-year simulation. For the IHME here on the lower right, you see that the results of the simulation is basically different. The curves are fitted differently. So as a result of this, you can have a situation where the medians of the annual model can differ from the 5-year model. And in this case, the agreement is best with the WFD-based data. So we suggest possible solutions. So solution 1, which is more difficult, but possibly more satisfactory. So we suggest to modify the annual based TFR model to capture additional autocorrelation. Then we recommend to use WFD-based data for estimation. We would project annually, and optionally for consistency, we could adjust trajectories so that the medians match the 5-year medians if such match is desired. Solution 2, which is much simpler but maybe less satisfying, would be that we continue using the 5-year based TFR model for estimation and projections. We would use aggregated 5-year data, and then we would interpolate each trajectory to get annual trajectories. And as a result, the 1-year medians and intervals will perfectly match the 5-year ones. So I say this solution is simpler. It's basically, one could use it already tomorrow. It's available right now. Whereas solution 1 would require more work. So the status of the base TFR package is that it's usable for annual simulation, as shown above, minus the additional autocorrelation. Projections take 5 times more time, so we need to parallelize projections. The Liu and Raftery 2020 method for including estimation uncertainty that Adrian was talking about is being incorporated into base TFR right now. And all the code is on GitHub. Currently, it's in a branch annual. So life expectancy at birth implemented in base life package. So we made changes in prior distribution of parameters that relate to the maximum increment K and the long-term increment of E0 Z. So I'm in the process of recomputing parameters related to UN scenarios. That is work that Helena Cruz Castañeda has done for WVP 2017. And Helena, if you are listening, I'm going to get back to you with questions about your script. And here too, we need to assess if autocorrelation is captured correctly or if the uncertainty is underestimated, just as like in the case of the TFR. We also need to assess if the gap model should be revised. And we we know already that the annual E0 estimates should not be interpolated, the estimates that are used for the estimation of this model. And again, there's a simple alternative. Instead of projecting annually, we could interpolate each trajectory from the 5-year model. Projecting life expectancy at birth with taking into account HIV/AIDS epidemic implemented in BaseLife HIV package. So after we update BaseLife, the necessary changes to BaseLife HIV should be straightforward. The only thing we would need is annual data on the past HIV prevalence, trajectories of future HIV prevalence for uncertainty assessment, and the past and future ART coverage. Okay, going to a MODCAS package for projecting mortality. So it has various functions that implement the Canisto method for extrapolating mortality rates. They already work for one-year age groups. The functions for estimating the modified Lee-Carter method, Lilly-Carter, they also work for one-year age groups. The main function MODCAS is currently wired only for 5-year age groups, but it should not be difficult to change it to work for one-year age groups, since all the wiring is there, including the one-year life tables. We need to assess if there are any changes needed to the Lilly-Gerland rotation methodology. So I need additional inputs from the UNPD, and these are the inputs for the PMD, for function that implement the PMD method of Kirill Andreev. Then function MLT for model life tables. Also, I will need the one-year age tables, and the function LOCWAT also will need an update. And finally, population projections, BasePop. So after we update MODCAS, the changes in mechanics for 1-by-1 projection should be straightforward. I'm working with Mark Weldon on using the same code for cohort component method, and he's working on a new package. So it would be nice if we have same code for the cohort component method across different software. Adrian mentioned Vladimira Kantorov's method for projecting percentage specific fatality rate that needs an update. And the version of BasePop with probabilistic migration is work in advanced progress. And there are some computing challenges that the division will need to address, and that's that the runtime of this package will be about 25 times longer, and amount of data generated will be about 25 times more, right? And it's already a lot right now, so it will be even 25 times more. So we argue that it's important to continue to compute 5-year projections, and that's for upward compatibility, to check annual results, and as a fallback. Okay, in the summary, so our work on supporting the division for WP 2021 is on target. We propose solutions to the challenges in moving the fertility and mortality models to one-year basis. And all our packages needed for probabilistic population are being updated and made available for the division to test. That's it for me.
Thank you, Hannah, and also for all the support. Any reaction from the participants? No?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, this is Denenko from the population division. I just want to thank Hannah for her persistent support over past many years. Hannah, in your presentation, you raised the solution for the total fertility projection. You provide the 2 solutions for the challenges. Personally, I prefer the second one, to use the 5-year data to then use interpolation to the single year. This one, because it's for single year data for many countries, the data quality is a challenge, and we do not know what's actually the data quality, what's the true data or real data. So the difference or the trajectory of the difference between years, it's a question. So 5 EM data is more reliable. Thank you.
Thank you. Danan, any other reaction? No, so we'll do a break now. We're a bit behind. It's 11:30. The program agenda was mentioning a 15-minute break. We'll maybe do 10-minute break. So we'll reconvene at 11:40. Okay, so let's resume. The previous session was more on the projection and the different option we can have or we are considering. And now we're going back to the estimates, and we'll see, we'll have 4 presentations from Leontine, Feng Qing, John, and Oli. These are different way of modeling robust time trends in both ISFR, TFR, but also what we're interested in adult and old age mortality. This will come also tomorrow. We'll not lose more time now. So Leontine, if you are ready, if you can take the screen and share your presentation.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, everybody can see the screen?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, so thanks for having me present a little bit on lessons learned from B3 and other methods for estimating time trends for WPP to 2021. Starting with just a quick summary of what B3 was about. So we developed it for estimating under 5 mortality, and since then Bruno et al. Have used it for 5Q10 as well. So it stands for a Bayesian penalized B-spline regression model. So very briefly, I like to distinguish between what is the process model, so what's the description of the indicator in the setup, versus what is the data model, how do we relate the data to the truth. So in B3, the idea of the process model is that we have a spline regression underlying the U5MR trend over time. So as illustrated here for, in this case, Norway, we have these spline functions, which are these polynomial functions. Those multiplied by their respective spline coefficients gives this red line that you see in the Norway plot. So it gives the spline regression fit. What we assume on these spline regression coefficients is that they follow a random walk 2, which is a random walk 1 on the rate of change, basically saying that if there's no additional information, say an extrapolation, we keep the rate of change constant. And then we have a little fix to improve projections beyond the most recent data point. In terms of the data model, we experimented a lot with trying to basically expand the menu of modeling options available at the time. So what we ended up with was introducing level and slope biases for a survey series so that they could be biased upwards, downwards, as well as in terms of their rate of change. For the variance, we included a combination of stochastic variance for VR type data, sampling variance for surveys, and then added to that was non-sampling variance to account for other kinds of random errors that weren't captured in the bias term. And then for dealing with outliers, we use t-distributions, so fatter-tail distributions for specific source types. And some data were used just as the minimum that was for incomplete VR. And then last but not least, in terms of sharing information across countries or these kinds of things. So in B3, the decision was made explicitly not to share information when it comes to a country's level or rate of change in B3. Sorry, I see now that there's checks going on. Okay, but that has nothing to do with my presentation, so I'll just continue. So in terms of hierarchical models, they were not used for countries' levels or rate of change. They were used to exchange information when it comes to the biases associated with surveys. So within a survey, within a source type, say DHS, what is the extent of your level and your rate of change biases? And they were also used to say something about the variance in these changes in the rate of change of the spline coefficient. So there were we had a country-specific variance parameter in the random walk 2 that was estimated hierarchically. To the next slide. The question posed by Thomas and Patrick was to say something about lessons learned. I think for me, I think the main lesson learned was what I like to refer to as the 90-10 rule, which is 90% of our development and post-development meeting time was really spent on 10% of all the country years that we had to focus on for this ICME exercise. So what do I mean by that? I remember going back and forth for like a week to get estimates that were reasonable for a country like NIU. And if you don't know where it is, that's because it's tiny. It's like a super small country. We went back and forth a lot to create additional rules to get estimates for earlier years, say the 1950s, 1960s, for those countries where we happened to have this one census that then resulted in results that seemed a bit odd. We had a lot of back and forths. We're still having back and forths about data inclusion, exclusion. So here I also included this little diagram of my favorite Bugs Bunny and Brainy Smurf. Like, it's fine as a statistician to come up with a model that works really well for the majority of cases, but it's really like the subject expert saying, hey, but what you're coming up with here in terms of an extrapolation or estimates in this data limited setting, they don't make sense at all. And it's really important to get those right. And in our case, it was the time-consuming part to get those right. So then reflecting on that a little bit, I'm thinking about, well, for WPP 2021, all these, to just summarize, all these different indicators need to be modeled over time to get these best time series to feed into the reconstruction exercise. Is B3 the way to go for WPP 2021 or not? So to answer that question, I would like to take it a bit more broadly. So put it in the context of the menu of modeling options that we have available for both the process as well as the data model. To learn from what we've done for B3 for U5MR, but also actually moreover what we've learned from other indicators. So I'll give some examples from family planning and MR. So then going to this context of thinking about what are the modeling options available. When it comes to the process model, I find it helpful to think about modeling options following under, do we want a structured part of the model versus do we only want an unstructured smoothing component? And I have a little bit of difficulty with terminology here, how to best describe it. But briefly, what I mean by a structured component is having some kind of a parametric function that captures dynamics over time. So what you can think about that is having some mathematical function to describe levels and trends. So for example, for TFR projections, but also for family planning, we're using logistic curves. So here on the right-hand side, we have a curve for total contraceptive prevalence over time that converges to this country-specific asymptote of total use. So this is a parametric function, so it's kind of a structured component of the model. If there's no data, there's still this structure to hold on to. You can then contrast that with what I call here a smoothing component. So B3 is just throwing some splines as at a data series. So it's you can still do some short-term extrapolations, but it's really like using the data. It's much more data-driven. It's more like data smoothing. So then the question that I posed there on the top is, should any new methods include a structured component, a smoothing component, or both? And I would really say that they have to include both. So use a structured and a smoothing component and the same model for all countries so that you can use one model to have with a structured component to fall back to in country settings where you have limited data, the smoothing component to fall back to for high quality data settings so you can still capture the data if the data are there. And then the second point here in terms of the in terms of the how do you do parameter estimation, especially in very data limited settings, for example, for that structured component, well, that's where hierarchical models come in. So sharing information across countries where you try to estimate country-specific parameters. So that was the first part related to the process model. The second part then is related to these smoothing processes. So there's all these different exercises out there and everybody seems to use something different. I'm guilty of that myself as well. So there's splines, AR1, random walks. Does it actually matter what you choose and what should you focus on if you only have less than a year available to come up with all these nice estimates? So I won't have time to go into the details on this slide, but it's available for maybe later reading or discussion. Basically, my take on this is that really when you are developing a model for an indicator, focus first on avoiding the 90 versus 10 rule that we learned from V3. So focus on getting the more problematic settings right, because then you can save yourself a lot of time, in my opinion. So focus on the choice of your structural component combined with what kind of a point projection you would get from your smoothing term. So very briefly, what I have here under this point projection bullet is, for example, if you choose a random walk for your smoothing component, it means that you keep the level constant beyond your data periods. If you choose a random walk 2, it means you keep your rate of change constant. If you choose an AR1, you converge back to a mean, and if you choose an integrated AR1, you have a rate of change that converges back to a mean rate of change. So this implication of a smoothing method, so what do point projections look like, combined with a structural component, looking into what you want, what you need for your specific indicator there first, helps you to save a lot of time not getting stuck in all these annoying situations later on. And then secondly, start with the simplest, most convenient options for the smoothing, especially for initial fitting, because that can get time consuming. So do whatever works best for you. To then later, when you have the first part right, you can look into more the details like, oh, should I have this specific random walk or an AR1? So that's some thoughts on the smoothing option. Then the second part is so far I talked about the process model, right? Describing the truth. So then what about the data model? So how do we relate the data to the unknown indicator of interest? So think about an observation as being the truth, some bias, and a random error term. When it comes to the data model, I think we have a nice menu too of modeling options, which really they're very useful to make your modeling life easier. So what we did in B3, which I think indeed works quite well, is consider these different bullet points I have here. So do add sampling and non-sampling variance. Do consider bias terms. It could be survey specific. Do consider including observations as minima and maxima. That's all you can learn from them. And then if you're dealing with outliers, which probably you are, consider fat tail distributions. Now, what I'm highlighting here is what I think is the headache plus, which again is the time-consuming part, getting the details right, is what to do with outlining data points. And I really see this as it's an open question, how to automate the approach for, are you going to exclude data or are you going to try to downweight data? And then a note on competition. If you're fitting the kind of models that we're discussing, you need hierarchical models. So you need to exchange information between different settings. So that means that your model needs to be fitted to a large set of countries, lots of parameters. So whenever you're fitting this model, it's going to be very slow if you do something Stan, JAX, or your own MCMC implementation. The good news here is if your model is, if it's possible to code it up in InLab, then even the global model would be faster run, which would be nice. Regardless though, even if you cannot use InLab, but you have to stick to something that's more slow for running a global model, I would say I wouldn't give up on considering a big, slow global model, as long as you consider constructing one country models to complement these global models. So what do I mean by a one country model? So after you fit a global model, you've learned about a whole bunch of non-country specific parameters. So what's the variability in survey biases? What's the variability in deviations in the rate of change over time? These kinds of things. once you've learned this kind of information, you can use point estimates and associated uncertainty of these non-country specific parameters from the global model, fix them, and then fit a one country model just to the data from one country alone, which is much faster to run. So even though developing a global model will take some time, then after you've done that, when you're in your modeling exercise for one country at a time, running the one country model shouldn't be too bad. And I think a good example here is what we've done for family planning, which is develop the FPAT tool. Okay, and then my last slide, because 10 minutes are over before you know it. So yeah, summary, lessons learned from B3 and other modeling exercises. So when it comes to the B3 model as is, I think with the current rules, and rules I mean like the 90% effort that we focus on getting the 10% of the country years right, I think it works reasonably well for U5MR estimation. But if you really want it for WPP 21, you need more adaptation. So back projections, if you want to deal with small countries, that will need some additional work. So in terms of the main lesson learned, like why did 9% of the development time, why did we have to spend 90% of the development time on 10% of the country years? I think not having a structural component in B3 by design, because at that point it was undesirable to have exchange of information between countries on levels or rates of change directly. But lacking that structural component, I think, means it's less suitable for WPP 2021 endeavors. Really, when it comes to 2021 endeavors, I would say think about your process model as needing a structural component as well as a smoother. If you have this combination, then your estimates, as I mentioned earlier, you can track the high quality data where you have it and fall back to the rates of change implied by the structural component if you don't have that data. So the plot here on the side is, again, that illustration from family planning where we have these logistic growth curves. We have fluctuations around these logistic growth curves so that if a country does have data, we capture the data, and otherwise our projections or our estimates go back to the structural part. Having this kind of a setup also allows you to run the same model setup for all countries, which I also think is desirable because like in past modeling exercises, there's been this distinction, oh, when countries have good VR, let's fit one model, and if countries don't have it, let's fit the other model. But in this day and age, when countries are improving their data systems and they're improving their VR, they're actually transforming from being this like, oh, not so good data country to, oh yeah, now I have this data. And then to avoid these difficulties, oh, what model to use? Well, if you have this combination model, you can use one model in both settings. When it comes to the data model, as I mentioned, I think you have some good options available. Also consider biases, consider non-sampling errors. But I do think that an open question is like how to go about excluding data, because this is so influential on your end results. And then the last summary point was yes, fitting a global model can take some time, but as long as you develop a one country model with it, the computational burden should be manageable. And that's all.
Thank you very much for sharing your experience and for trying to systematize. And I think this is some reflection we need to have also. Is there any immediate reaction?
I had a quick question. This is Adrian here for Leontina. I think this is a fantastic talk. I hope you systematize it and write it up. But just a question about splines. You know, from your experience, my observation about splines is that sometimes they fit data, you know, beautifully within the data and a little bit outside it. But when you're looking at, you know, longer term extrapolation from within the data, often they go kind of crazy. So I'm wondering what your experience is, and is that something, because WPP, of course, there's very long extrapolation, right? It's like 80 years into the future. So what are do you have thoughts about that?
I have a whole bunch of thoughts about that, but trying to focus on the important ones. So when you talk about splines, I think it's important to, I think you're talking more in general about like the smoothing component, because splines, as I wrote here, so I think like what's the difference between splines and adding like an ARIMA type process. Splines is just the fact that when you introduce splines, you introduce a function that is differentiable. So you get kind of something that's a bit more smooth. But what are you doing with the spline coefficients? Well, you can put any ARIMA process on the spline coefficients that you want. So there's, I think your question refers to splines or whatever the smoothing component is that you're using. So, so yes, so good point. By definition, these smoothing components, because they're just extrapolating recent trends, they're not good for long-term extrapolations. So that's why I don't think they can be used in data-limited settings. They cannot be used for extrapolating for 80 years. And that's why I think it's important that when you develop a model, even if it's just for estimation, you need a structural part to it so that you have some structure in your longer-term projections. Another question that's, when I was writing these slides, I was thinking about this. Like, so far, like I'm guessing that for the current, for WPP 2021, the idea is to keep separate estimation versus projection. Most, I see a lot of nodding. Okay, so the idea is to keep those separate. Yes. But of course, longer term, you can think about one model, right? As long as a model has a structural part with these, with this smoothing part, then it can be used for the periods with data and beyond. And sorry, Adrian, I missed your session because I had childcare duties. Hey, but I got to play outside. So the model that we have for the TFR projections, yes, it can be extended to also then capture the past, as long as it has both components.
Yeah, I'll just say that's actually my talk was about that, really about the fact that you can do it all in one, and that's that paper with Piran Liu is kind of the basis of what we were suggesting, and that has been really pretty much, I mean, it's in advanced stages of implementation for potential use in WPP 2021. So I think you're absolutely right. They can be done as part of one process.
Right. But then, so do you agree that you can summarize then what you have as, yes, there's a structural part, which is maybe double logistically, and then some smoothing thing added to it?
Yep, I do.
Patrick had also a quick question, I think.
It's a comment. And a question for Leontine related to this conversation. I agree with you, especially on the projection part, where you want to go very far into the future, that the structural form is helpful. And for countries with very sparse or limited data as well. The concern I have in the context of the estimation of the last 70 years of demographic estimates is that, as you know, as you have seen yourself when it comes, for example, to child mortality, but it's even more true for the adult mortality, and it's true to some extent for even the fertility in some instances. You have reversals of trends. You have stalls. You have all kind of historical situation where, for some periods of time, the secular trends, the long-term trends basically stop and eventually go into opposite directions. And in some instances, this is not bad data. This is real changes in trends. And this deviates from the typical functional form, like a logistic curve and so on. So we also need to deal with all these challenges, and they are into the 10% trouble cases.
Yeah.
So that's it. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think, yeah, agree with that. So that's the. Oh, someone's muting me.
Sorry. I was trying to mute.
Okay. I'm still muted.
Oh, we can hear you.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so very much agreed. So it's like the question, how should you set up your combination of structure part and smoothing part is difficult, because indeed a simple logistic curve is not going to work anywhere. I think for me, our experience with modeling family planning has been helpful, and I think is something to consider for WP type stuff, which is for family planning. We started with this logistic curve with deviations away from these logistic curves captured by a smoothing process. But then we found, okay, it doesn't indeed work very well when there are stalls. Basically, to say it more technically, when these deviations are non-stationary. So we had these deviations that return to the logistic curve. Well, that's actually not what's happening in practice. So how we changed this model was to say, instead of using this logistic curve with deviations away from it, let's model the rate of change. So the rate of change, when you think about a logistic curve, becomes a function of the level. So we get this slow rate of change, increased rate of change, decreased rate of change. It's kind of the same as we think about the double logistic for TFR projections. But then when you think about the smoothing part that you add, well, if you add an AR1 to the rate of change, you get this convergence back to a rate of change as compared to convergence back to a level. And that's the kind of approach that works really well to deal with stalls.
Okay, thank you. We can continue maybe later on during the small discussion time we will have. We can
Thomas,
move
can
now.
I?
Yeah. Oh,
this is Vladimir. I just raised my hand. I didn't. I just wanted to follow up on Leontin's point with the family planning model and the data. And I have to say, our experience with the family planning data, it covers very well the stalls. That's why we are also kind of able to analyze the stalls in the contraceptive use, also the declines in contraceptive use, which we have seen in a couple of countries already. So it's when the data are available, really that data part of the model, the data model, is following the data, especially if it's it's a good quality data, and the structural part helps us with the projections. So we do projections currently until 2030, but we might consider actually trying to test the results for longer periods of time. Just understand how it could be. Such type of the model could be useful for WPP indicators. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any other reaction? Sorry, I didn't check the raise hand in the participant list. No? Then we'll move to the presentation by Feng Qing. It's also about the B3 model, and Feng Qing has been applying this in situation where we need differential either sex ratio or differential mortality. So Feng Qing,
I'll share my screen right now.
Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. Sorry, there's a security setup on my laptop. I need to quit the meeting right now, and I will rejoin the meeting. Is that okay for you? Sorry about that.
No alternative, yeah. Quickly.
Sorry.
Patrick, you will need to readmit her, I think, when she will remove her security. And then she will need to log in again. I don't hear you.
While waiting, if anyone has any more questions to Leontine for a few more minutes while Feng Qing is connecting.
Actually, can I make another comment? Following up on the family planning. So what we've been doing for family planning is also subnational estimation. And there we've been comparing now like fits from just smoothing processes, so in-lab type fits, to the fits we get from FBET that has a structural component to it. And in periods with data, as like we're claiming, indeed, we find that we can get the same results from using one model or the other. And the difference really, it comes in when you look at the more data limited settings.
Yeah, now we can see.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry about that.
Go ahead.
So I would like to thank Patrick for the invitation to let me share my lessons learned from the B3 development and application to the model in differentials. I'm Feng Qing from King Abdullah University of Science and Technology, KAUST, based in Saudi Arabia. So in the previous talk, Leontin has already given a very nice overview of the B3 experience. And so now I would like to zoom in in one of the particular project that I co-authored, which is estimating the sex-specific U5MR. So in this project, we estimate the sex ratio, which is the ratio of male to female, which is a male to female mortality rate for IMR, CMR, U5MR for all the countries. And due to the data quality and availability in many developing countries, for example, here in Jordan, you can see that in the sex ratio of U5MR from different data series in the overlapping time differs in the level and trend. And also the shades around the data series are the sampling error. So you can also see that the sampling error associated with different data series also are different. So the curve fitting approach and data model are needed. And for countries with outlying sex ratio where gender discrimination exists, for example, in India, it is also very important to model the global expected sex ratio to help to identify the outlying sex ratio in such country. And here I show the plot of the sex ratio of U5MR from the US, which is ideal case. So for the US, we have the highest quality data source of VR data, and also you can see the sex ratio of U5MR in the US is quite pretty much stable over the whole observation period. But of course, it's not the case for most countries we have. So we have the data from with measurement of uncertainty, which is a sampling error, available on infant, child, and under 5 mortality by sex from various data sources, the vital registration survey sensors for all the countries, and the full model is a combine of the process model and data model, as Leontine already explained. So for the data model for measurement error, we account for the sampling and non-sampling errors and outlying data points. And for the process model for the true sex ratios of infant mortality rate and child mortality rate, it is modeled as a product of 2 components. The first one is a global expected sex ratio, which I will mainly talk about because we use B-splines model here. And the second component is a country year specific multiplier, which where we use a hierarchical time series model to estimate that. And for the sex ratio for the U5MR, it is derived by the sex ratio from the other 2 age groups. So in this plot, where the left part is already shown briefly by Leontine in her talk. So I share with you our model estimates of the global sex ratio of infant mortality rate and child mortality rate over the descending order of the total mortality rate in each age group on the log scale. So here we can see that there's a non-linear trend of the expected sex ratio in both age groups. So here we model this global trend. So all the dots, these dots are all the observations from all the country years. So it is estimated with flexible B-splines regression model, and the input is expected ratio for a given country year. The input is the total mortality rate for that country year. So for the B-splines model, we have the following settings in our model. So it is a symmetric third order polynomial with equal space nodes on the log scale input of the total mortality rate for the IMR and CMR, and splines are obtained within the equal to 95 percentiles of the total mortality rate. So here you can see that for IMR below the 5 infant deaths per 1,000 live births, we in our model setting we model the splines to be constant, and also beyond the high level of IMR, the splines is modeled as constant. Similar setting is applied to the CMR, and we penalize the spline with the second order differences in adjacent coefficients. And the vertical lines are the knots where we estimate the spline. So that is a global model by using the spline. And in order to model the differences, so the global model of the splines setting boils down to each country. For example, for India, in the green curve shows the global expected sex ratio for India by so for each country year, given a total mortality rate of here, I show the sex ratio of IMR. So given the IMR for each year in India, we are able to get the expected sex ratio based on the B-splines model. And the red curve shows the true level of the sex ratio of IMR in India. So in order to model the discrepancy between the global sex ratio in green curve and the true level of sex ratio in red curve, we use a hierarchical time series model with AR1 structure to account for the differences across country and also within country over time. So here are some of the country results, but I will skip for now because I think the last slide is more interesting because it's the summarize of the lesson learned. I learned from doing this project. So for me, I think so for this project, I think it's quite important to figure out the B-splines setting because here we apply the B-spline to data from all the country instead of country-specific data. So if there's any change in the B-spline setting, there's going to have changes to many countries. To many country-specific fittings. So some of the spline settings that I find is important are the interval lengths between the splines. So the smaller of the interval lengths we set, the more parameters we need to estimate so that it will result the slower model run. And the greater the interval lengths between the splines, the model fitting is, well, the model run is faster, but the model fitting will be less smooth because you leave a large gap between the splines input. And also the order of penalization for the spline. So in this project, we use a second order penalization, but in the other project that we model the differential of under 5 mortality across household economic status, we use a first order penalization. So it depends on the data. And also the range of modeling the splines function here, as I mentioned, we assume the spline to be constant at lower and higher ends of the splines input. So it depends on how far you want to estimate the spline model given the input data, and also depends on the data availability at the lower and higher ends of the splines input. So these settings are, I find that we need to, I need to pay more attention for this model setup. So again, and I agree with what Liang Ting mentioned, that it's much easier to start with one country run to have have a rough idea about what kind of splines setup you want to use for the global run. So here, global run, I mean, by modeling all the countries in the same model. So one country run is much faster, and you don't need to wait forever to have the global run results for the splines model setup. And also Liang Ting mentioned that inla is possible, and from my experience so far, I think it's a very good alternative because it can be implemented in R. There's an available package called inlar, and it is extremely fast. So for the recent project that I collaborate with Bruno, where we model the sex ratio for the mortality of older children. I'm using the inla to run a similar setup by modeling by using the random walk of order to model the nonlinear global relationship of the sex ratio. And it took less than 10 minutes to finish a global run. However, for my experience, inla is less user-friendly compared to JAX. So it will be quite complicated to, once the model is getting more complicated, it will require more coding and programming on how to set up the inla model. So I think without, I don't know someone who knows inla very well, and there's no way I'm able to implement the this current inla global run. So I think since we are discussing the WPP 2021, and I think from my previous experience with this model, sometimes it can be quite time consuming, especially for the B-splines part, to get the B-splines related parameters to converge using the MCMC. So I think it's quite worth to try out in inla if the model is not extremely complicated. It really depends on what you need. So the research that I'm talking about is here we published in 2014. If you want to know more about the details, please feel free to check out this publication. That is all. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you for sharing your experience and some advice, and also your exploration with inla.
Yeah.
This is something we maybe consider. Let's move on, not to lose more time, with John Wakefield, who will be talking about his experience of using modeling age-specific mortality rate, from summary birth histories and survey full histories over space and time. John? Okay, here we go.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yep, we can, and we can see also.
Great, well, thanks. Thanks for inviting me to present here. It's been very interesting. So yeah, I'm just going to briefly talk about some of my experiences working with under 5 mortality, subnational estimation. So I'm currently working with a whole group of people whose name is on the last slide, who are basically creating the official UN IGMI estimates for around 20 plus countries for under 5 mortality. So we've been using, so Patrick asked me to talk about my experience doing that endeavor. So we've been using household surveys and census data. So I just want to briefly talk about the modeling framework we've been using, my experiences, aggregation across space, time and age, and then a bit about computing and visualization. So first point is generally the data we see are available on different temporal and spatial scales, maybe on different age groupings as well. So we always try and build up the model to be flexible enough to incorporate all types of data, which basically means you have to start from the lowest level of aggregate of data you're going to see for any of those three components. And then there's some issues you have to be careful of when you're modeling across those three components, age, space, time, because you want to make sure you get an identifiable model. And we've been using INLAR and another resource I'll talk about later. And there you have to be careful that you impose the constraints correctly. And if you impose them correctly, then you tend to increase the computation time because it makes the model more complicated. So here's just one brief example for the spatial aggregation. So this is work I did with done work with Neil Marquez, and we looked at combining different survey data. Some of the older surveys and some of the more recent mixed surveys, these are all household surveys. So this picture here shows you the Dominican Republic, and so we have those dots are where the data are collected at clusters, so enumeration areas from DHS data. But then we also have mixed data where all we know is the area within which the data were collected and not the specific locations. So here we formed a model by taking a Gaussian space-time Gaussian process model and then aggregated up appropriately. And so there's a couple of other approaches that have been tried in the past, which we show in this paper don't give you such efficient, basically lead to bias. So, but it was quite a lot of work to do this, but you basically have to start from a lower level and then aggregate up correctly. Similarly, when we do work in time, sometimes we get data coming in at 5-year time intervals and some years at sometimes at 1-year intervals. And so what we actually do is model on the yearly scale. I mean, you could go below that, but we model on the yearly scale. So this just shows under 5 mortality, probably to death in the first 5 years of life. On the left, we just show the 5-yearly estimates where we have an underlying actually random walk model, and then on the right we show how we have a 1-yearly model. So although the data enters in at one level, we can estimate at a finer level of aggregation. In terms of computation, so we've heard a bit about MCMC and INLAR. So MCMC, sometimes it's the only thing you can do because at the end of the day, it is the most flexible approach, but we've extensively used INLAR for our work up until recently, but now we're finding that some of the models we try and fit, in particular when we try and combine full birth history and summary birth history data, we require something that's more flexible. And so there's this technique's been around for a while, something called template model builder, is essentially the same as INLAR without the pretty front end. But the way INLAR is both a method and a package, and the method is way more general than the package. And so TMB can be used to implement the INLAR method without the inflexibility of the package. So we've been using that recently as well. One point I wanted to emphasize, and others have said this, is that it's very important to have methods that are reproducible. And so both in terms of understanding the statistical formulation and also in terms of the coding. So we've developed a summer package, something called the summer package over the last 4 or 5 years, which is actually now quite general and flexible, and we're adding to it all the time. In particular, Richard Lee's been working on this a lot, and there's lots of functionality in there now, and so we have all our code. There's a GitHub site, so I'll give a link to this at the very end. But that's very important because that allows people to reproduce the results if they have the same data inputs. In terms of modeling, as you'll probably know, the majority of household surveys use stratified 2-stage cluster design. So one of the points I want to make is basically this area is hard because you have to understand all the data sources. And so these household surveys are quite complicated, and different countries, they have their own nuances. And so in the past, many people have just ignored the stratification. So the stratification is based on administrative areas and then urban, rural, and people just routinely ignore the urban rural aspect. And it doesn't a moment's thought, pretty much everything varies by urban rural status, and if you're oversampling urban areas as the DHS tends to do, then you're going to get biased estimates. So in particular for under 5 mortality, the rates are higher in rural areas, and they can be much higher. So in Malawi, for example, they're quite, we're finding 50% increases in rural areas as compared to urban areas. Other countries are less large increase. So that's another point to make. Countries are very different. So modeling whole continents is not, I don't think, a good idea in general. So we've always gone the modeling country by country route and then comparing results across countries. But you have to take into account this stratification, and it's not completely trivial to do that. And on the clustering aspect, so you get dependencies within households. So we typically use over-dispersed models which allow for those dependencies within enumeration areas. And so there's a paper that's about to come out just showing that ignoring the stratification leads to bias, and ignoring the clustering leads to inappropriate uncertainty measures. We also found, quite interestingly, that given the target of inference here is administrative area, level 2 administrative areas, the most general model you can use is a continuous Gaussian process spatial model. That's, a bunch of people have done that, but we actually found superior performance when modeling, when the target is admin 2 areas, if you use a discrete spatial model. And there's a bunch of reasons that I could talk about for a long time, but basically the aggregation is much simpler, and tuning these continuous spatial models is much more difficult than the discrete spatial models. In general, we use generative models, and what I mean by that is we use full probability models for the data. So rather than modeling log counts or log rates, we try and avoid that when we can, and come up and use methods where we have a single framework which allows each of the data sources to be generated. If we wanted to simulate data, we could do. Having a full generative model also allows you to model biases in different data sources. And of course, these biases are always relative to what you believe is the closest you can get to a gold standard. But for example, examining whether biases appear to be constant over time in VR systems or constant over space, those are all very important and difficult decisions. This just shows work we've done for these biases, are looking at combining full birth history and summary birth history for analysis we did for Kenya. This is work with Jessica Godwin, and just looking at biases relative to full birth history data in different data sources. Just briefly talking about the way the overall framework in the context of under 5 mortality. So if you have data from full birth histories, summary birth histories, and incomplete vital registration systems, then you want to jointly model all those data sources. And so writing down the likelihood for the complete data and then factoring that in terms of data source specific models, but having these theta link parameters are common parameters which allows you to join the data sources together appropriately. And then, so I strongly believe in starting with a full probability model, and then sure, you're going to need to make approximations along the way, but at least we can see that the data are being combined appropriately rather than just bolting together in a more algorithmic way, which sometimes happens. Just to show very briefly what we do with the summary birth history data. So summary birth history data, of course, you're missing exact times of births and deaths if they occur. And so the first work I did, this is all from Katie Wilson's PhD, we basically write down the full-on auxiliary data method where we imputed birth and death times for all of the data. And of course, that's a very time-consuming procedure, so that would take days to implement. And then we're starting with that basic framework from that summation in the top equation where we're averaging over birth and death times. We can make some approximations and we can examine those. And then then we use this template model builder technique. It didn't fit within INLAR, but the computation went down from something like 8 days to 10 minutes. And that just and then this little graphic at the bottom just shows how the summary birth history adds the information appropriately. This is the model we're currently using for subnational estimation. So we use a beta binomial model for modeling the outcomes. So these are the deaths in age group A from survey K in cluster C for year T. And so we have this hazard model. So we have this discrete hazards model. We model the biases in the HIV, and then we have age intercepts. So we model 6 different age groups. So probability of dying the first month, then months 1 through 12, then yearly beyond that. We have survey effects because different surveys have different idiosyncrasies. We have a temporal shocks, IID shocks. We have smoothers over age. So we have random walks over time for age. And then we have a spatial term, a marginal spatial term. And then this important term at the bottom, which is a space-time interaction. And we played with different models along the ones, some of the ones that Leontine talked about earlier. And this is the sort of output we see. So this is estimates for Malawi, the under 5 mortality over time in the 28 districts. And just then we can look at these area by area. So in Blantyre, these are the the 4 DHSs we're basing these estimates on. And here we're showing, so over on this side, we show the beta binomial of the gray models, the IHME local burden of disease estimates for the ones in whatever color that is, blue. And then we're comparing this here with, for Malawi, there's extensive data. So we can compare what we call the smooth direct, where we actually take weighted estimators, and we see quite a lot of correspondence. So this middle plot shows the uncertainty in each of the DSSs over time. This just shows, so as part of our modeling enterprise, we have to aggregate over urban and rural within each admin 2 area. So we need to estimate the urban and rural under 5 population. So this just shows if we were to, so we actually estimate that from DHS as well. This just shows if we were to model that, so these work out the weighted estimators and then take the log of those and smooth them over time. And this just shows if we assume that all those weighted estimates were just from some normal model and estimate the variance, we get these. So here we're comparing AR1, random walk 1 and random walk 2 models with different deterministic components. And these are predictions which we see quite large differences. The random walk 2 is the green and they smooth more. This is when we just take the noise as IID normal. But of course, from the weighted estimators, we actually get a measure of uncertainty from the survey, so that accounts for the clustering. And when we account for that, we see these quite different curves, which are a lot more reasonable, and we see less differences in the predictions, which is more reassuring. And finally, I wanted to talk about visualization. So this is some work I've done with Tracy Dong. And so this is looking at first dose of measles containing vaccine in Nigeria. And so we have states, LGAs, local government authorities, so states top left, then local authorities, and then pixel level estimates here. So the majority of work in this area is looked at pixel level modeling. And if you look at this map, these 3 maps, you'd think, oh, it's all easy. So green means higher levels of vaccination, so that's in the south. And then in the northwest, in particular northeast, you get much lower levels of vaccination. And so looking at this map here, it looks as though everything's easy. You know, you just do this at 1 kilometer scale and 1 kilometer squared scale. But of course, when you look at the uncertainty, so here's those 3 maps again at different scales. Here's the uncertainty. So red means 60%, so the width of a 90% credible interval. So over here, we really don't know what's going on. Ironically, we know what's going on here because this is the binomial MP1 minus P kicking in. So it's such low levels there that we actually get quite relative accuracy. So over here, the blue mapping for states means that we're actually estimating the vaccination coverage pretty well at the state level, as you'd expect. But as you get finer and finer, of course, the uncertainty increases. So the question is, how do we represent that uncertainty? This is one way of doing it. So we use hatching. So the denser the hatching, the more uncertainty is associated with those estimates. So this is something you can do at the state level, makes some sense. Whereas at the LGA level, it's much harder to see there. This is I'm also working with Jeff and Ollie, who's giving the next talk on HIV modeling, and this is using these ridge plots. This is something I first saw Jeff Eaton and his group using, and so this is the state level. So these are showing. So we've got coverage on the bottom here, you know, between 0 and 100% roughly, and so Lagos has got very good levels, but of course, there's uncertainty associated with every point. And down here, Zamfara it's got the worst levels, at least in terms of the median. If we do ranking, then it gets a little bit more tricky. So we can estimate the rank. So yeah, Zamfara looks like it's the worst out of the 37. But as soon as we get if you order the rankings, the 5th worst is Katsina. You know, there's getting quite a lot of uncertainty now, and even more so, we look at the best levels. So Lagos looks to be the best in terms of its coverage, but by the 5th area, then we really don't know. There's a lot of overlap in these rankings, again, emphasizing the uncertainty. This is another way of showing this. This is if you say, what's the posterior probability of the coverage, the measles vaccine coverage is greater than 50%. So there's very little chance up here that that's true, whereas down here, yes, it looks like that level has been achieved. And of course, you can use different targets. What Tracy and I have been looking at lately is saying, suppose, those continuous maps are very deceptive. You can use the continuous color scheme, but if you use discrete color schemes, then things become a lot more apparent. So for example, if I'm only allowed 2 colors, so this is a pixel level map. If I'm allowed 2 colors only, then I could, for every pixel here, there's a probability distribution over what we think the vaccination is and vaccination level is. And so we can assign a level to every pixel, but of course, every pixel, there's a probability we get it wrong as well. So here we can say, if I randomly put my pen down on this map, then there's at each point, there's an 87% chance that the color is correct. I am in the right, I'm in the right band. If we expand that to 3 colors now, it goes down to 76%. So this is the average true classification probability. And then if I go to 4 levels, then now I've got less than a 70% chance of correct assignment. So as we gain more and more colors, yeah, we get more discrimination. So we can see from going from here to here, we start filling in these boundary areas, gain another color, but there's a probability of incorrect classification. If I do this at the LGA level, if we wanted to say have 70% average true classification probability, I'm allowed 3 colors. And if we do it at the state level, I'm allowed 4 colors at the LGA level, and I get 5 colors at the state level. Okay, so just to finish off, so yeah, as Adrian mentioned earlier, I'm a great believer in getting the methods validated by the statistical community first, and then having, reproducible methods is more than just having a flowchart and bolting together different approaches. I think you need an overarching framework so we can lean on all the techniques that have been developed in statistics. And then, yeah, sure, making approximations within that framework is fine, but let's try and keep the overall framework correct. I haven't talked about covariate model. That's very tricky, and that people have used that a lot in this framework for under 5 mortality, in this approach for these approaches on particular continuous surfaces. But a lot of those covariates are modeled themselves, and accounting for the uncertainty, particularly when you use machine learning techniques, is not trivial. And so accounting for uncertainty, and then of course it's down to, if which parts of the uncertainty are in the process are important to include and which ones aren't. And that's just that's one of the hard parts here. Which parts do you put the effort into modeling, which don't you? And on the same level, which parts of which data do you leave out? So UNIGMI particularly leave out surveys that they went bad at some point. And so making that choice rather than looking at the data and thinking, I don't like the look of that series, and dropping it, of course, that's dicey. So that's a very difficult part of this as well. Another very hard part, which nobody's really worked out how to do properly in space-time, is how to do model assessment, because you have to respect all the dependencies in the data and also the design, such as stratification. So sorry, that was very quick, but there's more information at this space station website. And of course, I'm just the talking head. There's a lot of people involved in this endeavor. And so these are the people who've been involved. So thanks for your time.
Thank you, John. Any immediate reaction or question?
This is Adrian here. John, I had a quick, this is great talk. I had a quick question, a more high level thing, which is, so you're doing spatial modeling and the general conceptualization of space in demography, because you're taking distance basically as the basis of space, a kind of, the spatial distance, which is something that comes out of physical sciences and geology and so on. But in social sciences and in demography, proximity, it's more complicated than that, in that often 2 places, it reflects influence between the groups of people living in different places, which of course, on average tends to be higher when they're close in proximity, but often there are a lot of other things at play. So for example, we found that when we looked at correlations in fertility between different countries, we found that, if 2 countries had been colonized by the same country in the past, they tended to have higher correlations, and that was important. And often that had very little to do with physical distance. So do you think this general framework of looking at, spatial modeling using physical distance really carries across fully to demography?
Well, I think that's one of the reasons we do country-specific modeling and don't model between countries, because I agree that between country differences, yeah, there's cultural. I mean, I've even in modeling Europe, there's the age-old question is, should France and the United Kingdom be neighbours? I mean, that's something that's been argued for hundreds of years, as you know. Ireland and Great Britain as well. And there's other good examples. So yes, I think between countries, definitely there are cultural differences you need to take account of. Yeah, within countries, I'm more comfortable with doing that, but that only after we've conditioned on, different facets like urban, rural, and all that holds. And in the future, trying to include more covariates to put as much of that into the deterministic component as possible. But no, I agree. I think between country, that's one of the reasons I don't like, for example, some of the stuff, the you know, the IHME estimates, and because they do whole, you know, do global, you know, not global, but very large scale modeling with the same model and based on distance for lots of different countries. And I don't think that makes a lot of sense, but yeah, so your point is well taken.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Any other reaction? No? Okay. So let's move on with the last presentation from Ollie Stephen, which is on each specific fertility rate, also over space and time. Ollie, are you ready? Is Ollie here?
My screen?
Yes. Yeah, okay.
Marvelous. Thanks very much for having me on to do this. I will try to do my best to keep the time, even if you don't know what I say.
Thank you.
So this is some ongoing work to do a small area estimation of district level fertility by country in sub-Saharan Africa. We're interested in district level estimates of fertility for a range of reasons, including improved population projections at subnational level. Also, as John mentioned, my background or my work is focused in HIV, and we're particularly interested in district level fertility because it underpins the estimates of children living with HIV at the district level, which is a key epidemic indicator for countries to monitor their progress, as well as important for resource allocation of treatment and also prevention of mother-child transmission. Also, as has been mentioned, it's an important evaluation step of the ongoing family planning as a programmatic scale-up, which will be needed at the district level soon enough. So the goal here is to estimate annual ASFRs at the district level for sub-Saharan Africa from household survey data. So the main data to go into this model are household surveys, and so just as an example, so in Malawi, we have 4 DHS surveys, 3 malaria indicator surveys, and 2 mixed surveys. And so where available, we use 15 years preceding the DHS and mixed surveys for full birth histories, and the 5 years available in the malaria indicator surveys. The model doesn't yet consume the summary birth histories, but that will come in due course. So there are 2 sort of main challenges here, really. One is the nature of non-sampling biases, namely the displacement of births, or indeed the complete omission of births from birth histories, which I'll talk about in more detail in a moment. And also, second, similar to what John was talking about for the mortality data, the input data are available at varying spatial resolutions. Sorry. For the DHS data, we have GeoMask coordinates, which if we overlay with a district level shapefile, we can assign to districts. But for the mixed data, we can't, because we don't have the coordinates, and instead we need to rely on survey indicators, which means that the finest scale available is the region level. So talking about the non-sampling biases, in particular, so far, so we've looked to account for one particular effect, that is the birth displacement, and this is underpinned by the issue that full birth histories are collected for children in the 5 years preceding the survey, but only an abbreviated question set thereafter. And as births are asked about in the order in which they occurred, a savvy interviewer can reduce his or her workload by aging the 5-year-olds into 6-year-olds, asking half the number of questions and going home early. And so if we look at the Malawi 2015 DHS as an example, we have so time along the bottom, and I've also labeled the individual years preceding the survey going back in time. What we can see is there seems to be a jump in the total fertility rate in between the 5th and 6th years. Now, of course, that could happen. There are a variety of reasons why fertility may suddenly increase. And so it's extremely difficult to tell from a single survey whether this is a non-sampling bias or whether this is a true change in trend. But we don't have one survey, we have many surveys. So this is a plot of all the available surveys in Malawi, and therefore we can do an inter-survey analysis to estimate how bad this bias is. So in orange is the same 2015 DHS you were looking at in the previous slide, but now if you can see my cursor, what we can look at are other surveys with points in the same range as the early years, and look cross-sectionally at the same cohort of women in slices to sort of to estimate how far any individual survey point in a given year is from where we might expect the global trend to be. And so what we can see here is in the early years, perhaps this 2015 DHS is underestimating where we might expect the true trend to be, and then we have this 5-6 year jump here, and then perhaps this survey is now a better indicator of what the true fertility trend is. So that's sort of how we approach this. And so what we can do is we can do this for all the available countries, for all the available surveys. And so this is a national level regression model where we can say for a number of births in a given age group in a given time at a given time before survey year, we can fit a model which has an intercept, some random effect on age, some random effect on time, and then two TIPS effects, time preceding survey, where we have a fixed effect which is included if the time preceding survey exceeds 5 and not otherwise, and then a smoothing effect over all the TIPS coefficients. And what we can see here, if we so this is sort of a measure of relative fertility before and after this 5-year threshold. And in all the countries that have been analysed thus far, we see a TIPS effect, but the magnitude can vary quite substantially from, in this case, the fairly modest 3% in Tanzania up to the fairly substantial 16% in Malawi. From the countries looked at thus far, sort of around 8-9% is seems to be the norm. So now we can go down to the district level, and so we can say that the births in a given age group A, in a given district I, in a given time T, is a Poisson process as with our fertility rate lambda and some observed person year offset, which we can then decompose into this linear predictor here, which, as before in the national TIPS controlling model, we have an intercept, i.e. the average log fertility rate, a first order random walk over my 7 5-year age groups, second order random walk over my 20 odd years of interest, and a spatial model to measure spatial correlation when we go down to the district level. So really these sort of 3 smoothing effects represent the core of the model. And then also, as John said earlier, some interaction terms which permit some additional flexibility beyond the global trends. So we have 3 interactions, one between age and time, one between age and space, and one between space and time. So this is our linear predictor for estimating say fertility rates in an unbiased set, but as I laid out earlier, there are some biases that we wish to adjust for, and so we take this fertility rate, multiply it by our observed offset, and then adjust for these TIPS biases to produce our estimated log number of births at the district level. This then we can then regress against our survey number of births in the likelihood. And then finally, also, as I said, so one of the challenges is aggregating, is using data at various spatial resolutions. The mixed data are only available at the province level, and so what we do here is sum over. So this is an aggregation to go to national level, but it works for any given higher administrative level to sum all of the given births in all the districts, and then to divide by our observed person year at a national level or at any given provincial or regional level, and then do the same bias adjustment such that we can produce a predicted number of births at the region level, and then repeat the same process of using the survey births at that level. So this model has also moved into TMB. It was in INLA previously, but it was taking over 24 hours to fit. The spatial interactions are a real computational lift, but now in its present implementation, it's extremely fast to fit and sample. And so just a quick snapshot of some of the results. So this is TFR in Malawi on the left at district level and on the right at provincial level. And so immediately you can see the four major cities in Malawi in yellow. And what's quite interesting is that on the whole, there is not a great deal of spatial variation in TFR aside from urban-rural. This is sort of better exemplified on the right-hand side, and it's only about, it's under half a child's worth of TFR, as it were, from north to south. So in this particular case, the fertility rates in districts are, aside from urban areas, are quite well predicted by their admin 1 rates in which they reside. However, given that urban populations are much larger, if we were to look at this transformed into births, this would actually be a far more substantial difference than looking at the rates themselves. By contrast, if we look at Uganda, we see significant heterogeneity in district level TFR, including what looks like a southwest-northeast gradient. And unlike in Malawi, where most districts within each admin 1 unit reflected that fertility rate, here we see even significant heterogeneity within admin 1 areas. And so, so I think this is quite a nice example of the added justification sort of going further than using admin 1 estimates for fertility. We can then also aggregate all the way up to national and start looking at comparisons to the WPP. Here again, to Uganda and Malawi, to TFR plots. And you can see here that, so broadly speaking, the trends are in agreement. But what's interesting here is that the model follows the data much more closely and is much more flexible year to year. And indeed, going back to what Leontine was saying about the role of a process error, observation error. Do we expect a truly smooth underlying trend, and how should a structural underlying component versus smoothing be balanced? Then looking at some of the ASFRs, again here in Malawi, aggregated up to province level. And so what we're doing here is we are directly modeling the age data and directly modeling the ASFRs rather than back calculating them from TFRs. And we can see that the spatial the interaction terms are at play here, and we do get some markedly different age patterns at the admin 1 level. We also see this at the district level, but but it's just too busy to show. So some points. So first and foremost, that yes, there is significant district level heterogeneity that is actually quite poorly captured by admin 1 estimates. Non-sampling bias can lead to substantial distortion of fertility estimates in a given survey, but I think there's still more work to do to establish whether, when surveys are taken together, how much distortion is propagated if this bias is not taken into account. And also really the role of the bias adjustment really depends on the measure of fertility. So the published DHS fertility estimates are just for the previous 3 years. And therefore a displacement from say years 5 to 6 will have a relatively limited effect on the published estimates. But if you are reconstructing an entire trend, then of course a displacement starts to play quite an important role again. So adjustments can be done comparatively easily, so with an automated framework, which I think is consideration for the future WPP as you move towards a more sort of automated analysis framework. And also I think there's certainly much more work to be done within this model to consideration of so further non-sampling biases. So for example, as the age of women increases, whether the age of their first birth is displaced so further back in time, which will impact on so reconstructive fertility trends. This now actually has all been said. So one of the benefits of going last. In the projections, we see some issues with the random walks and the AR1 processes with uncertainty ballooning, and so some question of a more structured model so going forward, so that so whether that's at the national level, and then we can draw so district trajectories from that, and then also so consideration of survey so random effects and some sort of so multi-country so hierarchical so approach so to minimizing survey bias. And as I said earlier, this will soon incorporate summary birth histories and census as the data. That's what I have for you. So many thanks to Jeff Eaton and to John Wakefield for his thoughts as well.
Okay, thank you. The reason we asked for this subnational perspective was maybe we can gain some ideas when we need to deal with the 235 countries by looking at what is currently being done at the subnational level to estimate either mortality or fertility. So that's the reason we asked that. So this was the last presentation of this morning. Now we have half an hour. It was planned half an hour of discussion. I know we are a bit exactly half an hour after now late on our schedule. So those who need to leave may leave. Those who can stay for an additional half an hour and talk or share further wisdom with us, we're very happy. I would like to just ask those who leave, if we can also receive follow-ups or any recommendation or comments by email. So there's no, you can also maybe tomorrow or the week after, suddenly you have an idea crossing your mind, you can also come up with that through email or organizing an unplanned Zoom meeting. We had in the one of the last email we sent, we had a few questions that we wanted to maybe either to address or to cover during this discussion, or to help you maybe start talking or exchanging. So I don't know if, Patrick, can you maybe just put the, hello? You're mute. Okay. If you could, okay, here we go. So these are the questions, some of the questions we send you by email also, you receive that. So the first set refers to the WPP method protocol. We understand that we sent you last week. It was a long document, and but any thought or view on what you have read or what you have seen so far? If you find it's good, it's also nice to hear. If you find there is points to improve or clarify, or if you think we have left out any point, we would be happy to hear on these. So maybe we start with this chunk of this piece on WPP method, and then we'll move further on the other question on the slide. So if you have any reaction on what the document we share or what we have presented this morning between Patrick and Peter. No reaction.
Yes, this is Bertrand from WHO.
Yes.
So first, we want to congratulate you for this ambitious initiative and wish you move this forward as smooth as possible. And we share your sentiment of staff shortage, and we hope we could join forces wherever possible. And I think it would be helpful to have a meeting between John, Patrick, and Samira Somnas to discuss this later. But I have a specific question on Patrick's presentation as well. So I noticed that there are a few items on the gather list that don't have a clear timeline at this moment, especially those related to uncertainty estimates. So I think, admittedly, not every country cares about uncertainty interval, but when they care, the uncertainty estimates will indeed provide very valuable information. So that's one of the reasons the uncertainty items are included in the gather guideline list. So from Adrian's talk, I understand that it's quite possible to roll out the probabilistic approach for WPP 2021. But based on Patrick's last slides on the priority, it seems like for WPP 2021, the probabilistic modeling will only be applied to tier 1 data countries. It may take some time for tier 2 and tier 3 countries. So I feel like for countries with good data, with tier 1 data, the uncertainty interval will be very small anyway, and it will really add a lot of values for the tier 2, tier 3 countries to have those uncertainty estimates. So I'm trying to understand what are the challenges that are preventing an immediate switch to probabilistic modeling for tier 2 and tier 3 countries. Maybe Patrick, if you could help me understand that, that would be very appreciated. Thanks.
Thomas, do you want to take 2 or 3 questions, and then we see if there is some overlaps?
Okay, yes. But I don't see any other raised hand. So is there anybody else who wants to have a comment on that first point on regarding the WPP method and the method protocol? I don't see any raised hand in the participants, so I think
okay.
You can.
So
wait, Denzin
I see Denzin.
Yeah, Denzin. Yeah, go ahead, Denzin.
Thank you, Thomas. Not a question, but just a comment, because maybe tomorrow I will miss the first hour of the discussion. I noticed there's some discussion on age pattern of mortality, and Sam Clark will present. But just to remind ourselves that Michelle Gillett is also working on age pattern of under 5 mortality. So maybe not for this meeting, but later, he can share the information with the group, share documents, etc.
Yes, thank you. Then I have Leontine, you.
Thank you. So I don't have a specific question about the WPP method protocol, but related to Bo-Chen's point, can there be uncertainty for tier 2 countries? I was wondering if this kind of discussion can be postponed until Wednesday, because I'm looking forward to first having more information about what your thoughts are on reconstruction and then discussion about that. Because to me, it's really what's feasible and what's not feasible really depends on how it's going to be all put together. That's the big question mark.
True. But if Patrick wants to reply, I see Jeff also has a point or raise hand.
I'm not sure if the comment falls mostly under protocol or more under the third point about time trend modeling, but I think one thing that the group should think about a bit is this balance of what is process and how noisy a process is allowed to be versus what is observation error. And, you know, in particular, existing WPP estimates, by virtue of being 5-year projections, assume a very smooth process. The models used for the GBD tend to assume a very smooth process. I think Leontine's laid out a really nice framework for thinking about those things, but some harmonization across the dimensions of different indicators is something that I think we should be purposeful about.
Yes. Patrick, you want to react on the first point by Bochen? You're muted.
Very briefly, and then we can come back to it over the next 3 days. But in a nutshell, I agree with Bochen that in an ideal world, if time and resources are virtually unlimited, then the answer is yes, we should do all as best as possible. The challenge is we all operate under many constraints. One of the, I didn't go too far into a lot of the technical challenges, but we have less than half a dozen of people. John mentioned 30 plus people in the division, but not 30 people are working on WPP. It's less than half a dozen of people over the years that have been primarily involved in the production of estimates. So it's a very small team with limited capacity, including in terms of statistical strength and expertise. And a lot of what we speak about here involves, as Leontine mentioned, a lot of statistical modeling with a lot of challenges. And this 90 to 10 kind of ratio problems over the last decade with the various implementations we have already incorporated with the probabilistic work on the projection side. It is a typical situation where, yes, you can do something that works reasonably well for some countries, but fails miserably for some others. And to get the methods robust enough to work well for, in this case, not projections in the future, but really estimation from 1950 to today, in countries where there are very deficient data, very problematic data, very biased data, and not to do it on one indicator at a time, but to do it in a full population reconciled framework. There are a lot of challenges with a lot of bottlenecks, including computational ones, depending the implementations. And the timeline currently we have for 2021 revision is basically between now and end of August. And there are unfortunately, there are too many challenges in terms of data, in terms of methods, in terms of unknown, including even currently with the COVID situation where we are working from home without full access to all the resources that we need. And the current situation may come back eventually in the fall. We don't know. So there are far too many unknown that are, some of them out of our control, to be able to commit with 100% certainty the capacity to be able to do all of this work at scale, not just for a limited set of countries initially, but to do it for 235 countries, including small countries. Small countries, the smaller they are, the more the information in terms of disaggregation and volatility are challenging. And therefore, the current proposal is under limited resources. And even that creates a lot of challenges, because in the current setup of our division, we don't have any full-time, long-term staff member with all the statistical expertise. We have currently someone like Mark Weldon working with us, but on extra budgetary funds from a Gates grant. And this grant is finishing within a short period of time, and is not currently, there is no current long-term commitment for the next 5 years on this kind of statistical capacity within the UN to provide all the resources required. So between the IT computation resources to compute, as Adrian and Hannah have mentioned, single year, single age with full probabilistic capacity, 235 countries, balancing migrations by age and sex across all countries of the world requires substantial resources in terms of computing power, in terms of statistical capacity that currently are not available. There are far too many unknowns right now, and unless there is a firm known set of resources available to do all of this work within limited time. Right now, this proposal is a relatively pragmatic set that can be eventually adjusted in an agile way as additional resources becomes available, if they become available. But unless they are available right now, it's not realistic to be more ambitious than currently it's possible. But I'm happy to follow up with WHO and everyone else who is interested and able to provide additional support and resources to do more with limited time and resources. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, in terms, during the different presentation or reaction, we had, I mean, it's clear for all of you that we will go by in a one-by-one framework, which means single year, calendar year, and a single year of age. Is there any, we also, oh, sorry, I see Adrian, you have raised your hand. Is it related with Patrick's point or no?
Yeah, I agree with what Patrick said. I think, you know, that the practical side of resources is really important constraint, and the pragmatic approach of, you know, doing it incrementally makes a lot of sense. I think that Patrick said, you know, one could go faster if resources become available. I think one could think also that it might be possible to go faster if, for example, some of the methods do turn out to be, you know, applicable to more countries in a one-shot kind of approach. And that's another, it's not, you know, resources in the sense of more people, but it is, you know, I think notionally what I outlined could do that, but then as Patrick said, there's always the practical question of, you know, what happens when you try to do it in practice, and things happen. But it's possible that it might be possible to do it for more countries, you know, if everything goes well, put it that way. So and I'm glad to hear that Patrick is kind of open to that possibility.
Okay, thank you. I was telling that we have, Patrick has presented the different data portal, the different data display or data dissemination tool that we plan to release also with the WPP 2021. And this is related to the, let's say, the second point with WPP probabilistic projection upgrade. Is there any, I don't see anymore, okay. Is there any priority upgrade that we may have forgotten? We think that going one by one is for us one of the highest priority. We think that displaying more data and our method in a more transparent way and making available also the underlying empirical data is important. Do you see any other point or any other area where we should eventually also make some transition or some improvement? Or let's just open this because maybe we forgot, maybe we didn't think about something, and that would be interesting to hear. For example, in the talk of Hannah, we had Adrian and Hannah proposing that we keep running the 5-year WPP. So we have, in case, a fallback version of WPP should anything happen in the single year and something doesn't work. But it's also a matter of cross-checking if the single year framework really works and does reproduce more or less what we had in the past with the 5-year framework. So if you have any reaction on that. No hands. If there's any other point you think we may have forgotten or we would need to consider, or no? Well then, let's move on to another, to the last maybe chunk of question or point we have.
I see François, Thomas, I see François.
You see François, okay. Go ahead, François.
It was more related to the other point and a general observation, comments, reflection. Peter started by saying there's some noise in the data sometimes. There can be real trends. The observations are not always reliable. So making sense of that is not always easy. And within a one-by-one process, it might even be more complex. Leontine referred to the challenge of excluding data points, a more systematic approach. I've raised that before also. I think that's important because that can change a story quite a bit when you do curve fitting through empirical data. But then there's the other aspects of which I find very challenging is the adjustment. Because right now, a lot of the procedures that have been used as of now tend to use the data as is. Rarely makes it sometimes excludes data, but it rarely adjusts the data. So that's another facet that needs to be integrated. I actually had a couple of questions, if I may, at this point, because I raised my hand before when people were making presentations, but
sorry.
And it has to do with Anna. You mentioned in your presentation that with the one-by-one, there was less uncertainty in the trajectories. Is that only for the projection, or is that also including the uncertainty in the estimates that Adrian was talking about? Anna.
This is just for the projections.
This is just for the, and okay, thank you. And
Actually,
Adrian, you also said that in the examples that you gave, there was less uncertainty while using the uncertainty of the estimates, correct?
Okay, so no, there's when you use the when you incorporate uncertainty about the estimates, the uncertainty in the projections grows.
It grows. Okay.
Grows. There's an additional source of uncertainty that's in there. And I'll also just a quick note about the additional uncertainty in when you go from 5x5 to 1x1, or the fact that the existing model has less uncertainty. It's because of time autocorrelation, because there is time autocorrelation in the data, which was not taken into account in the 5-year framework, because correlation, which at a one-year distance can be significant, when you look at 5 years, it becomes small, and so it doesn't make much difference. So when we were developing the 5-year model, 10 years ago, that was not a big part of the uncertainty, so we ignored it. When you start looking at 1 years, there is additional autocorrelation that actually can make quite a difference. So it was an approximation that makes sense in a 5-year framework, but in a 1-year framework, it's no longer ignorable.
Thank you.
And so we would have to, extend the existing model to take account of that.
And while using the uncertainty of the estimates, is there more or less variation in the future trajectories?
There's more.
There's more variation. That's what I would have anticipated.
There is more, yes, and that's what I showed for Nigeria, for example. There's more, not a huge amount more,
but across. I'm talking across countries.
Oh, between countries, huh? I don't know.
Is there more variability in the trajectories?
I don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
Good question.
All right. Thank you for now. Appreciate it. And just to come back to Thomas's point, though, just so right now, if I understood well, also when Anna was presenting the two solutions, Is there a way to also go one by one only for the estimates and do 5-year aggregates for the projections? Because I believe with the one by one and the projection, the processing time was 25 times longer. So is that an option on the table? Thank you.
So the 25 times longer would be for the population. So, you know, we propose this for the TFR, which would be, actually it's just 5 times longer, but I think your question, it would be theoretically possible, right? We could do estimates on 1 year level and just interpolate, and then do the projection 5-year basis by using like aggregated.
For the SDG process, the priorities for the estimates, the one by one, if I understand well. And lastly, my final comment, sorry, curve fitting process like for the Q5, sometimes there can be some variations where you have a country where the Q5 is 175 or 190. It does not make a big difference in the demographic computation process. For the TFR, on the other hand, when you have variations of a 5 versus 5.4, it makes a big difference in the reconstruction of the population. So the impact of the TFR in the estimation process is quite important. So just curve fitting, I would be cautious about it in some countries. Thank you.
Thank you, François. Any other reaction before we move to the last 3 points down that are down of the slide? No. So what we try to get, so it's also in the coming 2 days when we have this general discussion, is try to have a kind of consensus among people that are around their screen here, because this will help us somehow to define, if we hesitate between one and another approach, this will maybe guide us a bit in our final decision. So that's why we appreciate if you can just share your thought, or just, for example, now we have, is accounting for non-sampling data by high priority or nice to have? If we can simply have a sense of what do you feel, what do you think, if it's, we should have that, or it's like, okay, that's not one of the priority, you should focus now and move on something else. So for example, if we address that point, just to hear a bit, okay, I see now Adrian and Leontine. So Adrian, maybe you go first.
Yeah, thanks. So I would think, yes, absolutely, it's very important. And I think that to take account of non-sampling data biases, I think throughout the history of the WPP in the estimation process, it's something which the analysts have been doing in producing estimates, have been doing in maybe an informal way, but it's really an important part of the value of the WPP estimates is that biases in data sources have been known by the analysts and taken into account, although not always in a fully documented way. So it's always been there, and I think an absolutely essential part of it. I think in the more statistical approaches, which was, pioneered maybe in the paper by, Leontina and Patrick and myself and François in 2012 in demographic research, again, the non-sampling data biases were in there, and that was a really important part of making that work. And again, in the work, my work with Piran Liu, non-sampling biases are vital, and I think that Leontina has shown beyond a doubt in all the things she's done that the non-sampling biases are important. So I think it's probably an advance to taking them into account, however you do it, is important. It can be done subjectively, which is the tradition, and that has worked pretty well. I think there's maybe an advantage in terms of transparency and reproducibility, and also saving the time of analysts that in doing it on in a more statistical way.
Leontine, I see also you have raised your hand.
Yes, although compared to Adrian, maybe not much to add. Or maybe to add, I think I don't really understand why you asked the question, because actually I think it makes your life easier if you do take it into account. If you're not going to take it into account and you want to follow the data based on the uncertainty that's just sampling error, then yeah, you're not going to find any consistent solutions.
Okay. Yeah, I agree. Any other reaction? I don't see any hands. No? Anybody think it's nice to have? It's something we should not focus on or spend time on that? No? Okay. Usually at the UN we have a gavel, so it's so decided. Okay, let's move on then. This is another important point we have to face, or we have to think of how we will address. For some countries, we don't have data in the past, for example. Our first data will start in 75. And then we have sometimes up to 20 or 30 years, or for other countries, maybe even longer. We don't have any data, empirical data, where there was no census, no surveys. So we haven't thought now, because it's something new, what approach is the best we should prefer in such case. We have mentioned here the option of going with some kind of hierarchical modeling, or the use of covariates, or we haven't made up our mind. If we use covariates, it is what kind of covariates and from what source, and so a bunch of related questions that comes with that. So we will appreciate whatever your view is on that, and if there is some, then we see if there is some kind of consensus or that emerge, or so if you can react to what any advice on this kind of what approach would be preferred. Yeah, I see Adrienne again. Go ahead.
Okay, I think certainly what I think we found is that, you know, doing a hierarchical approach without covariates has worked okay, in the sense it produces it produces estimates for the past which seem to be reasonable and are associated with big uncertainty, and that's particularly 1950s and 60s. And I think, you know, along the lines of what Bo Chen was saying, for example, you know, that could be valuable. I think that covariates might improve things, but then it's a lot of work to mobilize the covariates, to model them, to model the relationships, and it's not clear to me that there'd be a lot of value added. There'd be a lot of work. Maybe in this case, not a lot of value added. So I think perhaps the hierarchical modeling might be enough for given data quality issues.
Any other reaction? Oh, Leontine, yeah.
Yeah, I raised my hand not to move on, but I did speak on this as well. So if others want to go first in terms of their...
I don't have any other reason.
Okay, so I think what you should consider under point 2 is you make here the distinction between approach between like hierarchical modeling, covariates, etc. I find it more helpful to, like I was sketching, to think about what is the structure you want to put into the model? So then the structure could be, some kind of a logistic curve, or some kind of a covariate, or maybe you want to model the rate of change as a function of the level, or maybe you want to use U5MR to model another indicator. So make that distinction first, and then see how hierarchical models fit in there. And like when you talk about for U5MR, if you want to go back to 1950s, yes, you need to introduce some kind of a hierarchical structure, but the key question is, how are you going to introduce that? And so that first requires thinking about what is the parametric model that you want to use, where you're going to introduce that hierarchy. Yeah, I find it more helpful to think about it that way.
Okay. Patrick, you wanted to react on that or no?
Well, based on the presentation from Leontine and the various discussions that went on already, I think definitely there is some benefit at least to explore a mix of this functional form for the period without data and combined probably with some hierarchical structure. And as we have seen, Leontine didn't get into those examples, but the more we tomorrow we'll look eventually at their adult mortality, and in the case of maternal mortality, it's even more extreme. When in countries and periods where you have a very limited set of observations, And that's, I think, also what's happening with the family planning, with the contraceptive data for some countries. If you don't have a functional form, then it's very hard to be able to get any meaningful levels and trends over 70 years of observations. So there is probably indeed some benefit of imposing some underlying structure, long-term structure. And for countries where there is a lot of data, it should not really matter too much. For countries where we have very deficient data, it should help. And we need to basically a bit more time to experiment with various functional forms and various model specification, as Leontine explained. Thank you.
I see John Bryant. John, do you have raise your hand?
Yeah, just figured out how to unmute myself. For those earlier years, you know, like say the 1950s, 1960s, a lot of the data that's available for developing countries that's of any decent quality at all is population counts. So, you know, census data on population, you know, by age and sex and so forth, rather than direct measurement of fertility and mortality, or at least, you know, some sort of direct measurement of fertility and mortality is pretty weak. So, I mean, I think sort of success in reconstructing demographics for those earlier years sort of requires a slightly different approach than the kind of, the more sort of bottom up, you know, like, you know, model this component and then model that component and then sort of hope that they come together. And also perhaps more use of sort of old school demographic, you know, demographic techniques, indirect techniques and so forth to try and extract you know, information from those earlier years, but again, sort of depending very heavily on sort of simple census count data.
True, and that's what we are now doing, trying to fill the gaps with whatever information is existing, and we'll apply. Now we are collecting as much as we can, and then we'll try to apply a bunch of different techniques and methods, including all the indirect methods, to try to populate as much as possible these gaps in the past. But still, for some country, we'll not be able to add any. There will be some blank period where simply there was no census or even a population count that is available. So it's more for this kind of situation. But we will try to make use as much as we can with whatever existing data are out or are there. We have many that we will try to apply a set of standard techniques and estimation method. That's part of the work we have with Team RIF and the other Everton in Brazil, and all of to develop a set of our package or modules that we will systematically apply, and it will be standardized. We know, okay, we have this, we apply that way. But this is when we have data. Then we'll have some times where we cannot, and we still need to derive and this estimates for some countries. Any other reaction? I don't see other hands. And from I think the presentation we had this morning, especially with the subnational, we had that very clearly, that in terms of the speed of computing, like with this TMB, if I'm not mistaken, or TMN, I forgot what it was. I think we need also to explore that, and this will help us in our computation, and to reduce all the time or the duration of this computation. And I don't know, because we haven't yet decided, but probably we'll have also a country model first. And when analysts are working, we'll work with a country model, and at the end, we'll have some times of, we'll run everything together, but this one should not impede the initial work of analysts when revising a country and when reviewing the early estimates. In terms of time, I don't know if you want to discuss further. I see we have reached more than the half an hour we had planned. Is there any point you want to address? No? Anybody wants to react to one presentation, a point in particular? I have one point, maybe it's very specific, so maybe I can do that with Oli through email. But it's just when you were mentioning you will add some census, summary birth history and all of that. I think you can also try to reconstruct fertility history from census, from the number of children you have, and then you can, with their birth date and all of that, you could eventually, once you have the microdata, you can recompute the full birth history. So that could be an addition in the technique of the additional data you are considering.
Yeah, absolutely. That's on the plan. And also, if the censuses aren't necessarily available at subnational level, then we can aggregate all the way up to national to use the data at any level.
Nice. So any other reaction or comments? So I think we will then see us tomorrow. Tomorrow we'll focus on more specific, mostly on evaluating and modeling adult and old age mortality using different kind of data, VR, but also census and surveys, and also the surveillance side. And then we'll go for different modeling of mortality age pattern, fertility age pattern also. And I hope it will be also interesting and interactive. We don't face any problem. All presenter were today. The tomorrow presenter were today already joining, so I think that it should be fine. So I would like to thank you all. We'll see you tomorrow at 9:45, 10 to start again the session 2. And in the meantime, stay well and healthy. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.